Beneath the shifting sands of time, in the cradle of civilization, rise the weathered silhouettes of ancient monuments that once touched the heavens. Long before the pyramids of Egypt or the temples of Greece, the people of Mesopotamia built towering stairways of mud brick, vast structures known as ziggurats. These colossal platforms stood as bridges between earth and sky, their layered steps shimmering in the sun, their summits crowned with shrines where gods were said to descend, yet, even as their outlines remain etched into the landscape, the deeper story of their origin lingers in silence. Who first imagined these sacred mountains of man-made clay? Were they solely the work of Sumerian kings, eager to anchor their rule in divine favor? Or do their roots reach back to something older, a tradition inherited from forgotten hands? The ziggurats endure as more than architecture. They are echoes of a people striving to touch eternity, their purpose as mysterious as the civilizations that left them behind. Tonight, we journey into the heart of Mesopotamia to ask a question history has yet to fully answer. Who really built the great ziggurats? And what truths might still lie hidden within their crumbling walls? Chapter 1. The birth of Mesopotamia. Between the wide and restless waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, a story begins. It is a story not of kings or conquests at first, but of rivers, silt, and clay. Here, in the great alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, the earth was generous. Each spring, the rivers spilled over their banks, leaving behind rich soils that shimmered beneath the rising sun. In this landscape, half paradise, half wilderness, human beings began to shape the first great chapters of civilization. Archaeologists tell us that as early as the 6th millennium BCE, small settlements clung to these floodplains. The people of the Ubaid culture built modest villages of reed and mud, their homes clustered along irrigation channels that tamed the waters. Over centuries, these humble beginnings swelled into towns. Clay figurines, painted pottery, and the first signs of social hierarchies reveal a community edging toward complexity. The river's abundance demanded cooperation. Its unpredictability demanded foresight. From the rhythm of its floods, the first stirrings of organized society arose. By the 4th millennium BCE, during the Uruk period, the world began to change. Archaeologists uncover the outlines of the first true cities, Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, emerging like islands of brick amid a sea of marshland. At Uruk, massive walls enclose districts of workshops, homes, and temples. It is here that writing first appears, pressed into clay tablets by stylus tips, marking debts, offerings, and eventually myths. The cuneiform script would become humanity's first permanent record, a voice etched into stone when memory alone was no longer enough. But it was not only writing that transformed this land. Rising from the plains were structures unlike anything built before. Platforms of mud brick, layered one upon the other, ascending toward the sky. At first they were simple, low mounds upon which shrines were set. Yet as centuries passed, these platforms grew, both in height and ambition. In their presence, one feels the first breath of the ziggurat. The earliest of these sacred mounds is found at Eridu, a city the Sumerians themselves called the first of all cities, the dwelling place of Enki, god of wisdom and the deep waters. Excavations reveal temple after temple built upon the same site, each one replacing the last, rising ever higher. Layer upon layer of mud brick tells a story of persistence, a community unwilling to abandon its sacred ground, but determined instead to elevate it. What began as a shrine upon flat earth became a staged platform, reaching upward, closer to the divine. Why this desire to build upward? The floodplains of Mesopotamia are flat, a boundless horizon where the sky meets the earth in a thin, unbroken line. Perhaps in such a land, elevation became an act of imagination. To climb higher was to leave behind the marsh and step closer to the realm of the gods. In the myths, the divine resided in mountains, distant, untouchable peaks. Mesopotamia had no mountains of its own, and so its people made them. Brick by brick, they raised artificial summits, sacred mountains of clay. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the scale of construction at Uruk astonished even modern archaeologists. The Great Iana district housed vast courtyards and temple complexes, their walls covered in mosaic cones of colored clay. Rising beside them stood the Anu Ziggurat, its base a massive terrace on which the White Temple was built. Even in its weathered ruin, its shape conveys a sense of ascent, of earth becoming stairway, of worshippers climbing toward the stars. These were not only places of ritual, they were the heart of the city itself. Around the temple, offerings of grain, beer, and livestock were stored and redistributed. Priests became administrators, overseeing the flow of resources. Religion and politics fused together, bound by the towering presence of the temple mound. To ascend its steps was not merely to honor the gods, it was to acknowledge the power of those who claimed to mediate between heaven and earth. And yet, beneath this order, mystery lingers. Why did the people of Mesopotamia, more than any other early culture, pursue this form of building with such devotion? In Egypt, the earliest monuments were tombs. In the Indus Valley, sprawling cities were laid out with precision, but with little evidence of monumental towers. Only here, in Sumer, did the staged mountain become the central symbol of the city. Some suggest it was a practical evolution. Each generation rebuilt the temple on the same ground, layering new brick atop old, until the mound grew into a platform. Others argue it was symbolic, a deliberate attempt to mirror the cosmic order described in their myths. The heavens above, the underworld below, and between them the world of men, anchored by the sacred mountain. Still others whisper of influences older still, forgotten traditions carried into the floodplains by wandering peoples, echoes of a time before cities, before history. The clay tablets left behind offer fragments of insight. In Sumerian myth, the gods dwelt not in heaven alone, but in houses upon earth, houses that must be worthy of their presence. These were no ordinary dwellings. They were ekur, the mountain houses, thresholds between the human and the divine. To construct them was not an option, but a sacred duty, for only in such spaces could the balance between heaven and earth be maintained. The architecture itself reflects this vision. Built from millions of sun-dried bricks, often faced with kiln-fired brick for strength, the ziggurat rose in distinct stages. A grand staircase climbed its side, guiding worshippers upward, though few could ascend beyond the first levels. At the summit stood the shrine, small yet exalted, often described as the dwelling where the god would descend to receive offerings. These were not tombs, nor were they open sanctuaries. They were bridges, points of contact, earthly mountains where heaven touched earth. As centuries turned, the form spread across Mesopotamia. In Ur, in Lagash, in Babylon itself, the ziggurat became the axis of the city, its very identity entwined with the sacred tower at its heart. To look upon the skyline was to see brick mountains rising from the plains, each one claiming its city's place within the divine order. And yet, for all their grandeur, they were fragile. Built from clay, they crumbled without constant care. Each generation repaired, rebuilt, and expanded. The ziggurat was never finished, always in the process of renewal, as if the act of building itself was part of the devotion. Time gnawed at the bricks, but human hands refused to surrender. The birth of Mesopotamia was therefore not only the birth of cities, writing, and kingship. It was the birth of a vision in which humanity sought to reshape the flat horizon into a sacred landscape. The ziggurat became more than a building. It was a symbol of ascent, of connection, of permanence against the impermanence of clay and flood. And yet, when we gaze upon their ruins today, eroded mounds scattered across the deserts of Iraq, one cannot help but sense that their full story remains untold. Were they merely the work of pragmatic builders seeking higher ground for their temples? Or do they echo something older, something remembered dimly in myth? A time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were not yet fixed. The rivers still flow, the soil is still rich, and the crumbling silhouettes of these ancient towers still rise from the dust, silent yet enduring. They remind us that the first city dwellers of Mesopotamia did more than survive the floods. They dreamed of mountains and then they built them. But in those dreams, and in those bricks, lies a question that has yet to be answered. Were these towers born solely from human devotion, or do they preserve in clay an inheritance far older than the cities themselves? Chapter 2. Eridu, the first city and its sacred mound in the shifting silence of southern Mesopotamia, where desert winds now sweep over abandoned plains, lies the ghost of a city that once bore the title of the first. Eridu, its name whispered in the earliest Sumerian king lists. Its memory preserved in fragments of clay was, according to both myth and archaeology, the beginning of cities. Founded around 5400 BCE, Eridu stood at the edge of marsh and river, where reed-filled waterways gave way to dry land. To its first inhabitants, it was not merely a settlement. It was the dwelling place of the god Enki, lord of the freshwater abyss, the bringer of wisdom and crafts. Excavations in the mid-20th century revealed the layered heart of this ancient city. Beneath mounds of sand and dust, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. Not a single temple, but a sequence of shrines, each built atop the ruins of its predecessor. In total, more than a dozen temples were discovered, stacked one upon another in a vertical progression that spanned centuries. The earliest were modest, simple one-room structures of mud brick, but over time they grew larger, more elaborate. Their foundations raised higher, their walls thickened, their platforms elevated. To walk through these layers in the archaeological record is to watch a vision unfold. The birth of verticality in sacred architecture. The pattern suggests more than practicality. Each reconstruction was not a matter of repair alone, but of transformation. The old temple was buried beneath new brick, entombed within the rising mound, as though the past could not be destroyed, but only subsumed. In this way, the sacred ground grew into a platform, a man-made hill that elevated the shrine above the flat floodplain. By the time of the later constructions, the mound itself was already a symbol, a rising axis where the divine could descend. Why did the people of Eridu insist on this constant renewal, this repeated act of building higher? The Sumerians themselves left us hints. In their mythology, the gods dwelt upon mountains, far removed from the reach of mortals. The floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, however, knew no mountains. The horizon was endless, flat, exposed. To the builders of Eridu, perhaps these rising temples became artificial peaks, mountains of clay raised to meet the sky. Here, they sought to anchor Enki, god of the sweet waters, whose domain lay both beneath the earth and within the cosmic order. The choice of Eridu as Enki's dwelling place was not accidental. The site lay close to abundant marshes, where freshwater springs bubbled up from beneath the soil. To the Sumerians, this was the Apsu, the primordial deep from which all life had emerged. Enki, the keeper of wisdom, was also the master of these waters, bringing fertility to the land and knowledge to humankind. His temple, called Iabzu, the House of the Abyss, was the first stage in a long tradition of sanctuaries dedicated to bridging the human and the divine. The ruins of Eridu tell us that religion was never separate from the growth of society. Around the temple mound stretched houses of mud brick, hearths, and workshops, forming the nucleus of a settlement that grew steadily across millennia. As the temple rose higher, so too did the city expand outward, its identity shaped by the sacred axis at its core. Archaeologists see in Eridu the seeds of urban life itself, the centralization of worship, the organization of resources, and the coordination required for large-scale construction. Yet for all its importance, Eridu never reached the monumental scale of later Mesopotamian centers. Its sacred mound, though significant, remained modest compared to the towering Ziggurats of Ur and Babylon. Why did this first city, honored in myth and venerated in memory, fade into ruin while others surpassed it? The answers remain elusive. Some scholars point to environmental shifts. The marshes and rivers that once nourished Eridu may have retreated or shifted course, leaving the city stranded in desolation. Others suggest that new centers of power arose nearby, Uruk and Nippur, drawing influence and resources away. Still others believe that Eridu was never meant to be a metropolis in the way later cities were. Instead, it was a spiritual birthplace, a primordial city that set the pattern but yielded the stage to successors. The Sumerian king list echoes this sense of transience. It names Eridu as the place where kingship first descended from heaven, but then quickly moves the seat of power elsewhere. It is as if Eridu was destined to be remembered not for its dominance, but for its origin story, for being first, not for being greatest. And yet, the layered temples of Eridu carry a weight that cannot be dismissed. They show us that the idea of the ziggurat, the staged temple mountain, did not appear fully formed in later centuries. It was born here, in the quiet persistence of builders who returned again and again to the same sacred mound. With each generation, the platform rose higher, the shrine more commanding, the connection between heaven and earth more tangible. Eridu's ziggurat never reached colossal heights, but its symbolic ascent marked the beginning of an idea that would shape Mesopotamia for thousands of years. In later myth, Eridu was remembered as a place of firsts, the first city, the first kingship, the first temple, the dwelling of Enki, who gave the gifts of civilization. But memory is a fragile thing. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Eridu was already a ruin. Travelers and scribes who passed its site found only crumbling mounds and whispered legends. What once was the axis of the world had become a silent heap of bricks, its sacred mound eroded by wind and time. To stand at Eridu today is to face absence. The sand buries most of its remains. The outlines of houses and walls blur into the landscape, and yet, beneath the surface, the stacked temples remain, a vertical archive of devotion. They tell us that the impulse to build upward, to anchor the divine in clay, began not with grandeur but with persistence, not with towers but with shrines. The question lingers, as it always does in the ruins of Mesopotamia. Was Eridu abandoned because its purpose had been fulfilled? Was it the seed from which other cities grew, destined to be left behind once its vision had spread? Or does its fading hint at something deeper, a forgotten shift in belief, a lost chapter in humanity's first attempt to bind heaven and earth? The winds carry no answers. The mound lies silent, and yet, in the stillness of Eridu, the story of cities begins, humble, layered, sacred, and unresolved. Chapter 3: Uruk and the White Temple of Anuef. Eridu was the first spark of urban life, then Uruk was the flame. Rising from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia around the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, Uruk became the world's first true metropolis. By 3500 BCE, it was home to as many as 50,000 people, a scale unparalleled in its age, a city that stretched far beyond the reach of any village or town that came before. Here, the hum of craft workshops, the murmur of markets, and the rhythm of irrigation canals converged into something new, the architecture of civilization itself. At the heart of it all stood a platform of clay and stone, a raised mound crowned with a gleaming sanctuary. This was the White Temple, dedicated to Anu, the sky god. The temple itself, modest in size compared to later monuments, sat upon a massive terrace of packed earth and mud brick. The walls of the shrine were coated with gypsum plaster, which in the brilliance of the Mesopotamian sun appeared almost radiant. From a distance, it must have shone like a beacon, its whitewashed walls standing stark against the surrounding city of mud brick dwellings and reed thatch roofs. To the people below, it was more than a building. It was a mountain in miniature, a sacred axis piercing the horizon of an otherwise flat world. What is striking is not what was found inside the White Temple, but what was absent. Archaeologists uncovered no lavish treasures, no gold or precious stone. Instead, they found traces of fire pits, offering tables, and ceremonial vessels, objects of ritual, not wealth. The temple's significance did not lie in hidden treasures or secret chambers. Its power was its presence, its elevation above. The city, its declaration that the divine occupied a place beyond the reach of ordinary life. In dedicating this structure to Anu, the Mesopotamians elevated the sky god himself. Anu was distant, aloof, the supreme deity whose authority stretched over the heavens. His temple was not a place of intimacy, but of orientation. It marked the alignment of the city with the cosmos, a reminder that earthly power existed under the gaze of celestial order. To ascend the steps of the White Temple was to step symbolically toward the heavens, to leave behind the dust and chaos of the streets below. The architecture of the temple complex speaks to this vision. The terrace beneath the shrine was immense, constructed of countless mud bricks set in layers, bound together by reed mats and compacted soil. At its base, stairways rose sharply, guiding the worshipper upward. Upon reaching the top, the visitor would enter a rectangular sanctuary divided into chambers, with an altar at its heart. Ritual fires burned, offerings were made, smoke drifted into the open air. Here, in this elevated space, the divine was invited to descend, if only for a fleeting moment. Scholars often describe the White Temple as a prototype of the later ziggurats. Its form, sanctuary raised high upon a platform, set the template for millennia of Mesopotamian sacred architecture. Yet the question remains, what inspired this verticality in the first place? Why was it not enough to build upon level ground? Why elevate the shrine at such cost and labor? One answer may lie in the natural landscape. The flat floodplains of southern Mesopotamia offered no mountains, no high places where the gods might descend. The people built their own, fashioning artificial heights from the very clay of their land. In doing so, they recreated in miniature the cosmic mountain of myth, the meeting point of heaven and earth. To climb the platform was to participate in a reenactment of creation itself, to ascend from the chaos of the floodplain into the ordered realm of the divine. Another interpretation suggests that the elevation was practical as much as symbolic. The rivers of Mesopotamia flooded unpredictably, and raising the temple protected it from destruction. Yet practicality alone cannot explain the sheer scale, the deliberate effort to emphasize height and visibility. The White Temple was not merely safe upon its mound, it was commanding, visible from every quarter of the city, a constant reminder of the god's supremacy. There are those who wonder whether the idea of elevation itself might have deeper roots, perhaps echoes of a forgotten tradition carried into Mesopotamia by earlier peoples. In distant mythologies, the gods are said to dwell upon high peaks, Mount Olympus in Greece, Mount Meru in India, the sacred mountains of Anatolia, and the Zagros. Was the White Temple part of this same universal impulse, to place the sacred upon heights, to seek communion with the divine in spaces elevated above the ordinary? Or does its form recall an older memory, still, perhaps of structures now lost to time, that first taught humanity to raise its sanctuaries skyward? In the daily life of Uruk, the White Temple was more than ritual space. It was the city's axis. Surrounding the temple, the Iana district bustled with activity. Workshops for pottery and weaving, courts for redistribution of grain and livestock, scribes pressing cuneiform into wet clay. The temple was an economic center as much as a spiritual one. Offerings brought to the shrine were not only for the gods, but for the sustenance of priests and workers. To bring goods to the temple was to acknowledge both divine order and civic authority. Thus, religion and administration fused, and the temple mound became the beating heart of the metropolis. Uruk itself was unlike any city the world had yet seen. Enclosed within massive walls said to stretch 6 miles, it encompassed neighborhoods of artisans, farmers, and traders. Its influence reached far beyond the floodplain, as Uruk-style pottery and seals spread across Mesopotamia. Writing emerged here, not as myth or poetry at first, but as accounting, a tool to track the flow of goods into and out of the temple stores. And above all, this human activity rose the White Temple, silent, gleaming, eternal. Today, only its foundations remain. The white plaster has long since crumbled. The shrine collapsed into dust. But to imagine it in its prime is to picture a city organized not around palaces or markets, but around a sacred height. It is to see a people who believed that their metropolis was not merely a human creation, but a cosmic order made visible in clay. The White Temple of Anu stands as a threshold in human history. It is both modest and monumental, simple yet profound. It reveals a moment when architecture ceased to be shelter alone and became symbol, when building itself became an act of devotion. To raise mud brick upon mud brick was to ascend toward eternity, to carve into the horizon a vision of connection between sky and earth. And yet, questions remain. Did the builders of Uruk conceive this vision on their own, born of the flatness of their land and the vastness of their sky? Or were they heirs to something older, a memory carried across generations, dimly recalled in myth and made manifest in brick? The ruins do not answer. They only endure, and in their silence, the image of the White Temple continues to haunt us. A bright sanctuary upon a platform of earth, shining above the first great city of humankind, reaching always upward toward the distant heavens. Chapter 4. The Ziggurat of Ur. A stairway to Heaven. On the windswept plains of southern Mesopotamia, a colossal shadow rises from the desert floor. Its form is geometric, precise, a mountain made not of stone but of clay. This is the Ziggurat of Ur, the best preserved of all Mesopotamian temple towers, built more than 4,000 years ago. Even in its ruin, with only its lower stages surviving, it dominates the horizon. To those who once lived in its shadow, it was more than architecture. It was a stairway toward the heavens, a sacred bridge between the world of mortals and the eternal realm of the gods. The ziggurat was raised around 2100 BCE, during the reign of Ur-Nammu, the king who founded the third dynasty of Ur. At that time, the city of Ur was a thriving capital, a hub of trade and culture that commanded loyalty across southern Mesopotamia. To secure his legitimacy, Ur-Nammu turned not to palaces or fortifications, but to the gods themselves. He ordered the construction of a towering ziggurat in honor of Nana, the moon god, patron of the city. Cuneiform inscriptions etched into clay tablets tell us in Ur-Nammu's own words that he built the ziggurat for the gods. But behind this devotion was also strategy. To align himself with Nana was to ground his kingship in divine authority. The ziggurat was a monument of faith, but it was also a proclamation of power, an unmistakable declaration that the city of Ur stood at the center of heaven and earth. The structure itself was immense. Its base stretched nearly 200 feet on each side, a vast rectangle of mud brick faced with kiln-fired brick. From this foundation rose 3 colossal terraces, each receding inwards, their edges sharp against the skyline. A grand staircase of more than 100 steps climbed toward the summit, flanked by smaller stairways that converged upon a central axis. At its peak once stood a shrine, the House of Nana, where the god was believed to descend and receive offerings. From a distance, the ziggurat must have gleamed, its facade coated in bitumen and polished brick, catching the light of the Mesopotamian sun and the glow of the rising moon. It was not simply a building, it was a statement carved in clay. To enter Ur was to behold its ziggurat, towering above homes and palaces, visible for miles across the flat plain. It proclaimed the city's wealth, the king's devotion, and the god's supremacy all in one. To ascend its steps was not only a ritual act, but also a performance of cosmic order, each level carrying the worshipper closer to the divine. And yet, the ziggurat's meaning remains elusive. Was it a temple in the ordinary sense? A place where priests gathered to offer sacrifices and recite hymns? Perhaps. But unlike the temples of later traditions, the summit shrine of a ziggurat was not open to the masses. It was a restricted space, reserved for ritual specialists and perhaps for the king himself. Ordinary citizens would never have entered its heights. For them, the ziggurat was a presence to be observed from below, its towering form the embodiment of the divine order. Some scholars argue that the ziggurat was a cosmic mountain, a man-made echo of the sacred peaks where gods were said to dwell. Others see in its form a kind of axis mundi, a symbolic spine connecting the realms of earth, sky, and underworld. Still others point to astronomical alignments, suggesting that the ziggurat may have served as a platform for observing the heavens, tracking the movements of the moon and stars that guided Mesopotamian calendars. There is also the possibility of political theatre. To stand at the base of the ziggurat and gaze upward was to feel one's own smallness against the immensity of king and god. Processions would have wound through its stairways, priests ascending with offerings, the crowd below watching as figures climbed ever higher toward the summit. In these acts, power was not only declared but performed, embodied in the very geometry of ascent. The survival of the Ziggurat of Ur is itself remarkable. Built from millions of mud bricks, materials vulnerable to rain and erosion, it should not have endured. Yet through cycles of destruction and restoration, it has persisted. When Leonard Woolley excavated the site in the 1920s, he uncovered not only the ziggurat, but also the royal tombs of Ur, filled with gold, lapis, and ritual treasures. To Woolley, the ziggurat was the central pillar of the city's identity, a structure that bound its people across centuries. In modern times, portions of the ziggurat have been reconstructed, its monumental staircases rebuilt to echo their ancient grandeur. Visitors today can walk along the steps, their feet tracing paths once worn by priests and kings. And yet, as we climb, we cannot fully know what it meant to ascend in antiquity. Did the worshippers feel they were approaching the moon god himself, ascending into his luminous domain? Or were they participants in a ritual drama, one that reminded them of their place within the cosmos and their dependence on divine favor? Cuneiform hymns to Nana speak of his temple as a radiant dwelling, a place where heaven touched earth. In one, The ziggurat is described as a house whose head is lifted high, whose foundation is firmly set, a binding of heaven and earth. Such phrases capture not only the physical form of the monument, but its symbolic role as a cosmic tether. In the imagination of Ur, their city was not simply a human settlement. It was a point of contact, a chosen place where the infinite bent down to meet the mortal. The ziggurat also embodied the rhythms of the moon. Nana's cycles of waxing and waning mirrored the cycles of fertility, of growth and decay, of order and renewal. As the moon rose above the desert, its pale light must have struck the shrine at the ziggurat's summit, illuminating the sacred space. To the people below, this was no coincidence. It was alignment, harmony between the heavens above and the work of their hands. And yet, for all that we know, mysteries linger. The shrine itself is gone, leaving no clear record of its form or its rituals. We do not know what offerings were carried to its heights, what words were spoken in the presence of the god, what visions or silences filled its chambers. We know only the foundations, the stairways, the terraces, mute witnesses to acts now lost to time. To stand before the Ziggurat of Ur today is to confront these silences. Its immense bulk rises against the desert sky, and yet it feels incomplete, unfinished, its summit broken, its meaning fractured. Perhaps that is fitting, for monuments such as this were never only about what was seen. They were about what was evoked: awe, reverence, mystery. They were about reminding human beings of their place beneath the vastness of heaven. The ziggurat endures as both ruin and revelation. It is a stairway carved in clay, leading upward into questions we cannot answer. Was it a temple, an observatory, a symbol of kingship, or a memory of some older tradition lost to history? Or was it all of these at once, layered together like the bricks that form its terraces? The desert offers no certainty. The wind moves across the bricks, the sky shifts above, and the ziggurat remains, immovable, enigmatic, eternal. To gaze upon it is to feel what those in Ur once felt: the pull of height, the nearness of heaven, the weight of mystery. And in that moment, one begins to sense that the Ziggurat of Ur was never simply a building. It was a question in brick, a stairway leading not only upward but inward into the oldest depths of human longing. Chapter 5: Uruk Ziggurats and the First Reforms. The story of Mesopotamia is not only the story of kings and conquest, but of fragile beginnings, of experiments in stone and clay that would later echo across centuries. Long before the Ziggurat of Ur rose into the desert sky, another ruler, less remembered yet equally significant, sought to carve a path between the mortal world and the divine. His name was Uruk. He ruled the city-state of Lagash around 2350 BCE, a time when the cities of Sumer were still shaping their identities, and when the great forms of Mesopotamian religion were only beginning to crystallize. Uruk is remembered by history not first as a builder, but as a reformer. In a society where temple elites and officials often exploited the weak, he issued proclamations that sought to restrain corruption, to protect widows and orphans, and to limit the excesses of priests and tax collectors. Fragments of cuneiform tablets preserve these reforms, some of the earliest written attempts at codified justice in human history. Yet his vision was not confined to laws alone. The ground he walked upon also bore the weight of new forms, sanctuaries raised not at the level of the earth, but lifted above it. Archaeological remains from Lagash are fragmentary, broken by time and erosion, but they hint at foundations that seem more than ordinary. Elevated platforms of mud brick, reinforced with baked brick facing, suggest the earliest experiments with raised sanctuaries, structures that may have been precursors to the grand ziggurats that later defined Mesopotamia. Unlike later monuments, these platforms were modest in size, their lines simpler, their surfaces bare. Yet the idea was already alive: to place the dwelling of a god above the plain, to lift divinity toward the sky. Why would a ruler who sought to cleanse corruption also choose to build upward? Perhaps the answer lies in the very chaos of his time. The Sumerian city-states were locked in cycles of rivalry: Ur, Uruk, Umma, and Lagash, each striving for dominance. In such turbulence, a ruler's legitimacy could not rest on arms alone. It had to be sanctified. By raising temples higher, Uruk was not only glorifying the gods, but positioning himself as their chosen mediator. The sanctuary was a stage upon which political order and divine will could be performed as one. The remains of these structures are faint, eroded by millennia of wind and flood, and what survives often comes to us not as standing walls, but as shadows in the soil. Layers of brickwork, traces of stairways, outlines of platforms half swallowed by the desert. Excavations at Tel al-Hiba, identified as ancient Lagash, have revealed temples built on artificial mounds, their levels ascending step by step. Though far from the colossal terraces of Ur or Babylon, they carry the seed of the same vision, the mountain in miniature, the axis between heaven and earth. Uruk-agina's reign is remembered as one of reform, yet even his reforms reveal the deep intertwining of religion and authority. His proclamations do not separate the civic from the sacred. Instead, they root justice itself in divine sanction. To restore fairness was to honor the gods. To protect the weak was to preserve cosmic order. In such a world, building a sanctuary was not only an act of worship, but of governance, a visible reminder that the ruler's authority was aligned with the divine. The scarcity of evidence leaves us with more questions than answers. Were Uruk-agina's elevated sanctuaries intended for processions, where priests ascended in view of the people? Or were they quiet, restricted spaces, where offerings were made in private before the god's statue? Did the people of Lagash see them as symbols of protection, rising above the floods that often devastated their fields? Or as towers reaching upward in defiance of rival cities? The silence of the ruins offers no reply. What we do know is that the idea endured. The modest platforms of Lagash were not forgotten. In the centuries that followed, rulers across Mesopotamia embraced and expanded them, layering terrace upon terrace until the ziggurat became the signature form of Mesopotamian architecture. The stair-step mountain of Ur, the towering Ziggurat of Babylon, all find their faint ancestry in these early, half-erased foundations. What began as an experiment in elevation became a central symbol of kingship, worship, and cosmic order. There is also something poignant in the contrast between Uruk-agina's reforms and the monuments that shadowed them. His laws sought to bring justice to the earth, to curb the greed of men. His sanctuaries sought to lift the gods into the sky, yet neither survived in permanence. The reforms, inscribed on clay, have come down to us only in fragments, their details debated and uncertain. The sanctuaries themselves have crumbled into mounds. All that remains is the echo of intent, a ruler who, in his time, reached both downward toward justice and upward toward heaven. The ruins of Lagash remind us how easily beginnings are lost. While later kings carved their names into history with stone and conquest, Uruk-agina's legacy drifts like dust across the plain. Few monuments bear his mark, and fewer still his memory. Yet in his modest sanctuaries lies a profound truth, that even the greatest monuments begin humbly, as gestures in clay, as visions half-formed in uncertain times. Standing before the worn foundations today, one might not feel awe but quiet wonder. The bricks lie low, their edges worn smooth, their lines almost invisible, and yet, when viewed through the lens of history, they take on a greater weight, for from such fragments grew the stairways of Ur, the towers of Babylon, and the cosmic mountains of Mesopotamian imagination. Perhaps that is why Uruk-agina matters, not only for his reforms, not only for his sanctuaries, but for the way he embodies the fragile beginnings of ideas that would outlive him. His ziggurats, if they may be called such, were not colossal. They did not pierce the sky. But they carried within them the seed of a vision, that the divine and the human could be joined through form, through height, through the ritual act of building. And so we are left with fragments, broken bricks, scattered inscriptions, questions that linger. Were these structures symbols of order in a world of rivalry? Were they humble offerings, or bold experiments pointing toward the future? The desert holds its silence. The answers remain veiled. What endures is the sense of continuity. From the faint platforms of Lagash to the towering stairways of Ur, the impulse was the same: to bring the gods closer, to lift heaven toward the earth, and to proclaim the ruler as the bridge between. Uruk-agina's sanctuaries are almost gone, but the vision they carried would rise again, greater, higher, more enduring. In their silence, they remind us of a deeper truth, that history's greatest monuments rarely begin in grandeur. They begin as whispers in clay, as foundations half buried, as gestures that seem small until centuries reveal their weight. And in that fragile beginning, half seen and half forgotten, lies the mystery that still calls to us from the sands of Lagash. Chapter 6. the Ziggurat of Nippur and the seat of Enlilin. The heart of Sumer, where the slow bends of the Euphrates once nourished fields of barley and reeds, rose a city unlike any other. Nippur was not the seat of an empire. It commanded no armies, and its rulers rarely held sway over distant lands. Yet in the imagination of Mesopotamia, it stood at the very center of the cosmos. For here, it was said, dwelled Enlil, the lord of wind and destiny, the god whose word shaped the fate of kings and kingdoms. Nippur's sacred precinct was known as the Ekur, the mountain house. To the people of Sumer, it was not merely a temple, but the very axis upon which heaven and earth were joined. Clay tablets describe it as the place where the gods assembled, where decrees were spoken, where the order of the universe was fixed. The ziggurat that rose within this complex was more than brick and mortar. It was conceived as a bond, a tether holding the divine to the human realm. Archaeological excavations, first undertaken in the late 19th century by American expeditions, revealed the depth of devotion layered into Nippur's soil. Beneath the shifting sands lay the foundations of temple upon temple, rebuilt and enlarged across centuries. Each new ruler who sought legitimacy, whether from Ur, Lagash, or Babylon, turned his attention to Nippur. To restore the Ekur, to add bricks to its ziggurat, was to align oneself with Enlil's eternal authority. In doing so, a king claimed more than political power. He claimed to act within the cosmic order itself. The ruins tell of this ceaseless cycle of renewal. Foundations of crude mud brick from the earliest days give way to more carefully fired bricks stamped with royal names: Ur-Nammu, Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal. Each ruler left his mark not through conquest, but through the act of rebuilding. The Ekur became a palimpsest of faith and ambition. Its stones a record of countless hands striving to maintain a link between worlds. Unlike the Ziggurat of Ur, gleaming in its desert solitude, or the White Temple of Uruk, dominating a metropolis, Nippur's ziggurat was never about political spectacle. Its purpose was more subtle, more profound. To the priests and pilgrims who journeyed here, the temple was a cosmic anchor. They believed that if the bond between heaven and earth were broken, disorder would seep into the world. To rebuild the ziggurat was to renew creation itself, to reassert the alignment of the human realm with the divine. Cuneiform hymns describe the Ekur in reverent tones. They speak of it as the mooring post of heaven and earth, a place radiant with light, where the great gods gathered in assembly. One hymn praises Enlil as seated upon his lofty dais within the Ekur, dispensing decrees that no mortal could overturn. In such texts, the ziggurat is not a backdrop, but an active participant in divine order, a stage upon which the drama of existence was maintained. What did a pilgrim see when they approached Nippur in its prime? Perhaps from afar, the stepped terraces of the ziggurat rose above the flat floodplain, shimmering in white plaster beneath the sun. Ascending its stairways, the pilgrim would leave behind the dust of the earth, each level carrying them closer to the sacred. At the summit, a shrine awaited, where priests invoked the presence of Enlil and enacted rituals that bound the city and the cosmos to his will. The ascent itself was a form of devotion, a journey mirroring the soul's passage from mortal ground to divine height. And yet, for all its sacred prestige, Nippur was also vulnerable. It had no armies to defend it, no empire to sustain it. Across the centuries it was sacked, abandoned, and rebuilt. Its ziggurat crumbled, only to be raised again. Each destruction threatened to sever the cosmic bond, and each restoration sought to mend it. Through this cycle, Nippur embodied the fragility of the human attempt to fix eternity in clay. The site today is a broken landscape, fragments of walls, scattered bricks bearing the names of kings long vanished. Excavators uncovered thousands of tablets, records of prayers, contracts, and myths. From these fragments we glimpse the centrality of Nippur, not in power, but in meaning. Even in ruin, the place whispers of its former role as the Axis Mundi, the meeting place of gods and men. But questions linger. Was the Ziggurat of Nippur conceived from the beginning as a cosmic anchor, or did centuries of rebuilding weave that meaning into its form? Was the temple a literal dwelling place of Enlil, or a symbolic mountain recalling humanity's memory of sacred heights lost in prehistory? Some have wondered if the image of the ziggurat, rising in tears, was more than architecture, if it echoed older myths of primeval mountains, or even ancestral memories of structures now vanished. The silence of the ruins does not answer. What endures is the sense of presence, of a city that believed itself to be the navel of the world. Unlike Ur, with its kingship, or Babylon, with its empire, Nippur held something less tangible, yet more enduring. The conviction that destiny itself was written within its sacred walls, and so the Ziggurat of Nippur remains, half buried, half remembered. Its bricks no longer rise to the sky, its shrine no longer echoes with hymns, but in its fragments lies a vision that transcended power and politics. The dream of a structure that held heaven and earth together, binding the cosmos in fragile, enduring balance. As we stand at the edge of its ruins, we are left with a quiet thought. Perhaps the greatness of Nippur was not in its size, nor in its wealth, but in its role as a reminder that the true center of a civilization is not always its throne, but the sacred ground where its people believed the universe itself was held in place. Chapter 7, Babylon and the Tower of Babel. The annals of human memory, no ziggurat rises higher than the one said to have stood at the heart of Babylon. Known to the Babylonians as Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, it has long occupied a place where history and myth entwine. Ancient sources speak of a terraced tower nearly 300 feet tall, its vast steps lifting the sanctuary of Marduk above the plain, a beacon for all who entered the city. For the people of Mesopotamia, it was no ordinary structure. It was the axis of their world, a monument that anchored their gods to the earth while proclaiming Babylon's ascendancy over every rival city. And yet, in cultural memory, Etemenanki is overshadowed by another name, the Tower of Babel. The biblical tale tells of a humanity united in ambition, building a tower that reached toward heaven. In response, the divines scattered their tongues, dispersing them across the earth. Whether the story arose as a distant echo of Babylon's ziggurat or as a symbolic parable of human pride, the association has endured, fusing scripture with archaeology, myth with brick and clay. The foundations of Etemenanki were first laid during the reign of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, though its most ambitious reconstruction came more than a millennium later, under Nebuchadnezzar II. It was Nebuchadnezzar who sought to restore the ziggurat to towering heights, binding Babylon's destiny to Marduk, the city's patron deity. His inscriptions proudly declare the raising of its terraces, the strengthening of its walls, and the fashioning of its summit shrine, where heaven itself was thought to descend. When the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began his excavations in Babylon in 1899, he searched for this legendary tower. By 1913, he uncovered a massive square foundation of fired brick, each side stretching over 90 meters, an immense base that matched descriptions from ancient texts. These remnants confirm that the Ziggurat of Babylon was no mere legend, but a tangible structure of staggering scale. Yet even as the bricks were catalogued, questions persisted. Was the tower truly as tall as chroniclers claimed? Or had centuries of retelling magnified its height, transforming fact into awe-filled legend? For the Babylonians, height was not mere ambition, it was theology in clay. The Etemenanki was conceived as the very link between the realms, the stairway upon which gods might descend and mortals ascend in ritual devotion. At its summit stood a sanctuary known as the Esagila, dedicated to Marduk. Here, priests conducted rites that renewed the covenant between city and deity, sustaining the order of creation itself. To ascend its levels was to journey closer to the divine. To behold it from the city below was to feel the presence of eternity rooted in stone. Descriptions preserved by later Greek historians amplify its grandeur. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, spoke of a colossal tower of 8 stages, rising in colored tiers. Though modern scholars debate the accuracy of his account, the imagery he provides contributed to the mythic aura that clings to Etemenanki. In these accounts, one senses the mixture of awe and disbelief it inspired in foreign eyes, an impression so powerful that it traveled far beyond Mesopotamia, eventually shaping the biblical narrative of Babel. The question of its function lingers. Was the Ziggurat of Babylon a literal challenge to the heavens as scripture suggests? Or was it an act of devotion, the ultimate architectural form through which humanity sought to honor its gods? In Mesopotamian hymns, the ziggurat is never a monument to human pride alone. It is a dwelling, a cosmic axis, a bond between realms. Yet the biblical retelling shifts the tone. What the Babylonians saw as piety, later storytellers cast as hubris. Perhaps both truths coexist. An awe-inspiring structure that evoked reverence. but also revealed the restless ambition of humanity to touch the sky. Calderway's excavations, though groundbreaking, left as many mysteries as they solved. Much of the ziggurat had already been dismantled in antiquity, its bricks repurposed by later builders. What survived were traces, the colossal footprint, fragments of stairways, foundations that suggest the weight of a mountain once stood upon them. Reconstructing its true appearance requires balancing these remains with scattered textual references, from Babylonian cuneiform tablets to Greek chroniclers and Hebrew scripture. Each source offers a piece, but none the whole. In its day, Etemenanke would have dominated the skyline of Babylon. Imagine standing at the processional way, lined with glazed lions and dragons, and gazing upward as the tower rose, tier upon tier above the city walls. Its surface may have gleamed with bright plaster, catching the desert sun, while at night, fires and offerings marked its summit. The ziggurat was not simply a building, it was the visible embodiment of Babylon's claim to universal rule, a city made the center of the cosmos. Yet the fate of the tower mirrors the fragility of all human monuments. By the time of Alexander the Great, Etemenanke was already in ruin. Ancient accounts tell us that Alexander ordered its reconstruction, but his death ended the project, leaving the tower to crumble further. Floods, earthquakes, and centuries of neglect reduced it to rubble. Today, the site is little more than a scar of baked brick in the earth. Its once mighty terraces collapsed into formless mounds, and still, its memory endures. The Tower of Babel remains one of the most evocative stories of antiquity, retold across cultures and centuries. Its image of humanity striving upward, only to be struck down, speaks to a timeless tension between aspiration and limitation. Yet in Babylon's own vision, the tower was not a defiance of heaven, but a celebration of it. It was less a rebellion than a reaching, less pride than devotion. Perhaps what lingers most is the ambiguity, the space between myth and stone, where truth dissolves into symbol. In the ruins of Etemenanke, we are left with echoes, a foundation vast enough to support a mountain, inscriptions boasting of divine dedication, myths warning of overreach, and above all, the silence of the desert, where once a tower sought to bridge the infinite. The Tower of Babel remains more than a ruin, more than a story. It is a mirror of humanity's oldest question. How close can we come to the divine? And how far are we permitted to climb? Chapter 8. Ashur and the Ziggurats of the Assyrians, high upon the banks of the Tigris, where cliffs rise above the water and winds sweep across the northern plains. The ancient city of Ashur once stood as the heartbeat of the Assyrian world. Unlike the softer landscapes of Sumer or the marshes of Babylon, Ashur's setting was severe, its walls pressed against the rugged stone of the highlands, its temples commanding the horizon like watchtowers of eternity. Here, in this city that bore the very name of the god Ashur, the Assyrians wove together religion and empire, sanctity and power. And here too they raised ziggurats, austere and formidable, their stepped profiles marking the sky with the authority of both heaven and king. The Assyrians inherited the form of the ziggurat from their southern forebears, but they did not replicate it in spirit. In Sumer, temples such as those of Ur and Nippur had been centers of devotion, expressions of cosmic order and divine favor. In Babylon, the towering Etemenanke rose as a celestial axis, half myth, half monument. But in Assyria, the ziggurat took on a sharper edge, no longer only a bridge between earth and the gods, but a proclamation of imperial destiny. Each rising tier echoed not just prayers, but conquest. Archaeological traces at Ashur reveal platforms crowned with temples dedicated to Anu, the sky god, and Adad, the stormbringer. These were no modest shrines tucked within city streets. They were raised upon massive substructures of mud brick. Their foundations sunk deep into the earth, their summits lifted high above the river. From below, their bulk dominated the skyline. From above, they framed the empire in miniature, as though the world lay spread beneath the gaze of its divine patrons. For the Assyrian kings, these ziggurats were more than sacred precincts. They were seats of legitimacy. To stand upon them was to be seen as chosen, upheld by the gods themselves. Assyrian inscriptions speak of the careful rebuilding and embellishment of Ashur's temples across centuries. Kings such as Shalmaneser I and Tiglath-Pileser claimed to have restored shrines to their ancient glory, reinforcing the bond between ruler and deity. Yet what emerges is not simply devotion. but the layering of power upon power. Each generation of kings inscribed themselves into the sacred architecture, ensuring that their authority was not merely political, but written into the very bones of the city. The design of Assyrian ziggurats was often harsher than their southern counterparts. Where the Babylonians favored grandeur and ornamentation, the Assyrians preferred solidity and height, structures that gave the impression of fortress temples. Their ziggurats, in form and feeling, mirrored the empire itself, unyielding, martial, forged for endurance. Reliefs from later palaces depict them as massive, looming presences behind the walls of fortified cities, unmistakable markers of divine presence and imperial dominance. But even within this hardness lay mystery. At Asher, the Temple of Enlil and the Ziggurat of Anu were described in cuneiform texts as the mountain house and the bond of heaven and earth. The ancient language betrays a continuity of vision. Even in the militarized landscapes of Assyria, the ziggurat was conceived as more than stone and clay. It remained a cosmic ladder, a rising axis through which fate was bound and decrees of the gods descended. That duality, part fortress, part bridge to heaven, made the Assyrian ziggurat a reflection of their worldview, a people both deeply pious and relentlessly expansionist. To understand these structures, one must also consider the Assyrian character. Unlike the Babylonians, who looked inward to their sacred city, or the Sumerians, who built networks of rival temple states, the Assyrians looked outward. Their empire stretched from Anatolia to Egypt, from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean. Their gods, therefore, were not cloistered in singular sanctuaries. They marched with their armies, carried on standards, invoked in conquest. In this way, the ziggurat was not just a house of worship, but a staging ground of empire, a place where the king demonstrated that divine order itself was aligned with Assyrian expansion. Yet questions remain. Were these ziggurats still sites of pilgrimage and prayer for ordinary people, as they had been in earlier ages? Or had their accessibility narrowed, their sanctity claimed primarily by kings and priests? Excavations at Asher suggest restricted access, sacred courtyards enclosed by high walls, terraces guarded by gates. Unlike the open temple precincts of Sumer, these were spaces of controlled ritual, emphasizing hierarchy as much as piety. In their shadows, the people may have glimpsed the divine, but from a distance. The ruins of Asher tell only fragments of the story. Much of the city was destroyed in later centuries, and excavations in the 20th century uncovered only foundations and scattered remnants. Yet what survives hints at the scale of the vision. The raised platforms, the temple courtyards, the stairways that once climbed skyward, all whisper of a world in which religion was inseparable from rule. Even in ruin, their outlines suggest the silhouette of towers once higher than the city walls, their summits aligned with the heavens. One cannot help but imagine the scene, a king ascending the ziggurat steps at dawn, the river mist curling below, priests chanting hymns to Anu and Adad, incense rising as if to meet the clouds. From that vantage point, the king was no longer merely mortal. He was the chosen intermediary, the one whose conquest reflected divine will. The people in the courtyards below may never have climbed those heights, but they would have seen the tower, and through it, the unshakable image of Assyrian dominion. Were these towers then truly sacred, or had they become symbols, sacred veneers draped over imperial propaganda? Perhaps they were both. For the Assyrians, who saw no distinction between the will of the gods and the rise of their armies, there was no contradiction. To expand was to obey heaven's decree. To rule was to serve Asher. The ziggurat, standing immovable above the river, embodied that fusion of faith and force. Today, the site of Asher lies quiet, its ancient temples reduced to mounds and broken brick, its towers erased by time. Yet the silence carries echoes. It is the silence of drums that once beat in victory, of hymns intoned in smoke-filled sanctuaries, of wind whistling through stone stairways long since collapsed. To walk its ruins is to sense both the grandeur and the gravity of a civilization that built not merely to honor gods, but to enshrine empire itself. And still, questions linger. Was the Assyrian ziggurat truly a ladder to heaven, or had it become a throne of earthly power? Was its sacred presence felt by the common soul, or was it reserved for kings cloaked in divine mandate? The answers remain obscured, half buried in clay tablets and shattered walls. yet the vision endures. Towers that sought to merge the eternal with the temporal, to bind conquest with creation. The Ziggurats of Ur stand in memory as a different kind of monument, less ornate, less mythologized, but no less powerful. They remind us that sacred architecture, like history itself, is never neutral. It serves, it proclaims, it endures, and in the shadows of their ruins, we are left to wonder whether the gods of Assyria once looked down from their lofty summits, or whether it was only ever the kings who gazed down upon the world below. Chapter 9. Akkad and the Lost Ziggurats of Sargon's Empire. Somewhere between the coursing rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, hidden beneath centuries of shifting soil and forgotten waters, lay the city of Akkad, the beating heart of the world's first true empire. It was here, more than 4,000 years ago, that Sargon of Akkad rose from obscurity to unite the cities of Mesopotamia beneath a single crown. His reign, beginning around 2334 BCE, transformed the fractured landscape of rival Sumerian city-states into something altogether new, a centralized empire, bound by roads, armies, and a shared vision of divine kingship. And yet, for all its importance, Akkad itself has been lost. The city that once commanded the known world remains a ghost in the archaeological record. No towering walls, no ruined gates, no stepped temples rise from the earth to mark its presence. Only the echo of its name survives, carried down through chronicles and clay tablets, as if history itself conspired to shroud it in silence. Ancient texts tell us that Akkad was no ordinary capital. It was a city consecrated to the goddess Ishtar, a place where temples and ziggurats rose as visible tokens of the empire's devotion and power. The kings of Akkad, Sargon, his grandson Naram-Sin, and those who followed, spoke of themselves not merely as rulers, but as chosen servants of the gods, upheld by divine favor. And in Mesopotamia, divine favor demanded physical form. It was made visible in clay, brick, and monumental stone. It is unthinkable that a city of such stature lacked its own sacred towers. The question, then, is not whether ziggurats once rose above Akkad, but what became of them. The silence of the archaeological record is haunting. Unlike Ur, Uruk, or Babylon, where the outlines of temples and terraces still linger in ruin, Akkad has vanished without a trace. Scholars have proposed many locations, near modern-day Baghdad, somewhere in southern Iraq, or along the Euphrates, where shifting channels may have buried it in silt. Excavations have yielded possibilities, but no certainty. Each hypothesis ends in frustration, as though the earth itself resists giving up the secret. Was Akkad destroyed so thoroughly that not even its foundations remain? Or does it still slumber beneath fields and villages, awaiting rediscovery? Inscriptions hint at its grandeur. One hymn praises Akkad as the seat of kingship, its sanctuaries radiant with divine light. Another text describes offerings made in its temples, rituals that bound the empire together under the gaze of the gods. Naram-Sin, styling himself the King of the Four Quarters, boasted of dedicating temples to Ishtar, Shamash, and other deities. If later cities built their own ziggurats as expressions of cosmic order, then surely Akkad, the first true imperial capital, would have done the same. Yet what form these monuments took, whether towering stepped pyramids of brick like those at Ur, or more modest raised sanctuaries, remains unknown. The absence is not merely architectural, it is existential, a void at the center of Mesopotamian memory. Some scholars suggest that Akkad's disappearance may not be an accident of time, but a consequence of history. Around 2154 BCE, the empire collapsed under the combined weight of internal strife, famine, and invasions by the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains. Later, Mesopotamian traditions remembered the fall of Akkad as a cosmic rupture, a punishment from the gods for the arrogance of its kings. One text describes how Enlil cursed the city, turning its once fertile fields into wasteland. Could this memory conceal a deliberate erasure, a systematic destruction of its monuments so complete that even its ziggurats were leveled to dust? In Mesopotamian thought, to destroy a temple was to sever the bond between heaven and earth. If Akkad was cursed, perhaps its sacred towers were reduced not by neglect, but by intention. And yet, there is another possibility, that Akkad was not erased by malice, but by water. The rivers of Mesopotamia are restless, forever changing course, flooding, silting, and burying the works of human hands. Entire cities have been swallowed by their shifting channels. Perhaps Akkad lies entombed beneath river mud, its ziggurats preserved in silence, waiting for the spade of archaeology to uncover them? If so, then the first great imperial ziggurats still exist, unseen, a secret foundation beneath the fields of Uruk. The mystery deepens when we consider the symbolic role Akkad's temples must have played. Sargon's empire was not merely political, it was cosmic in ambition. By uniting Sumer and Akkad, he claimed a universal kingship, sanctioned by Ishtar herself. His successors extended that vision, declaring themselves rulers of the four corners of the world. Such claims demanded monuments that mirrored their scope. The ziggurat, with its tiers climbing skyward, was more than a shrine. It was an axis, a proclamation that the empire itself was anchored in divine order. To imagine Akkad without such towers is almost impossible. Their absence in the soil only sharpens the enigma. What remains instead are fragments, echoes in texts, shadows in later traditions. Centuries after Akkad's fall, the Babylonians and Assyrians remembered it as the model of empire, its rulers invoked in both admiration and warning. When Hammurabi built his Babylonian kingdom, when Ashurbanipal ruled Assyria, each echoed the precedent set by Sargon. And yet, none could point to the ruins of Akkad's sanctuaries. It was already a city of memory, half real, half mythic, its monuments carried in the mind rather than in stone. Archaeology has offered tantalizing hints. Tablets discovered in other cities mention Akkad's temples and festivals. Seal impressions depict step structures that may represent its towers, but no excavation has yet unearthed the unmistakable lines of a ziggurat, bearing the stamp of Sargon's empire. The Akkadian ziggurats remain suspended between presence and absence, known only by inference. They exist, paradoxically, by not being there. Monuments that endure as questions rather than as ruins. This absence itself carries meaning. In the story of Mesopotamia, the missing ziggurats of Akkad are like a silence between notes, a space where imagination must fill what archaeology cannot. Were they smaller, less enduring than the colossal towers of Ur? Or were they greater, their destruction all the more thorough because of their power? Did the first true empire mark its capital with the first imperial ziggurats, monuments that inspired those that followed? Or did Akkad's rulers instead invest their energies in conquest, leaving their architectural legacy fragile, soon erased? As the sun sets over the plains of Mesopotamia today, the land gives no answer. Farmers still till the soil, unaware of what may lie beneath their feet. Villages rise and fall, as impermanent as the channels of the rivers that shape them. Somewhere beneath that shifting earth may lie the buried terraces of Akkad's sanctuaries, the forgotten stairways of its ziggurats, or perhaps they are gone forever, their bricks dissolved, their form preserved only in memory and myth. And so the first great capital of empire remains an enigma, an empire remembered but a city unseen. Its ziggurats, if they ever stood, are monuments not of clay but of silence, teaching us that history is as much about what is lost as what endures. Akkad's towers haunt the imagination, rising not from the soil of Uruk, but from the collective memory of humankind, where absence itself becomes a kind of presence. In that silence, one truth lingers. The first empire built its foundations on towers that may never be found. And perhaps that is their greatest mystery. That the ziggurats of Akkad endure not in ruin, but in the shadows they cast across time, beckoning us to seek what may never be revealed. Chapter 10. The Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu northwest of Babylon, on the arid plains where the desert horizon stretches unbroken. A vast silhouette still rises against the sky. It is battered, weathered, and fractured by time, yet unmistakable in its form. The Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu, erected in the 14th century BCE, remains one of the last great monuments of Mesopotamia's long architectural tradition. Its very survival, though eroded by centuries of wind and sun, speaks to the ambition of the Kassite dynasty, a people who ruled Babylonia for over 400 years and yet remain shrouded in mystery. Dur-Kurigalzu was not a city of slow, organic growth like Uruk or Ur. It was a planned capital founded by King Kurigalzu I, who sought to anchor Kassite power in the heart of Babylonia. At its center rose the ziggurat, a stair-stepped mountain of mud brick that once towered in 3 colossal stages. Dedicated to Enlil, the Lord of the Winds, the ruler of destinies, it proclaimed that Kassite kingship, though foreign in origin, was sanctioned by the same gods who had watched over Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. From its summit, the ruler and the priests of Enlil would have commanded views for miles, the ziggurat itself a beacon visible across the plain. Archaeological surveys reveal something of its construction. Millions of sun-dried mud bricks were laid in careful courses, bound with layers of reed matting and sealed with traces of bitumen to protect against water and erosion. This was not merely repetition of older forms. The engineers of Dur-Kurigalzu appear to have refined the techniques inherited from centuries of temple building. The angles of the walls, the internal drains, and the precision of the brickwork all suggest an advanced understanding of how to sustain such massive structures over time. Where the Ziggurat of Ur has survived largely through repeated rebuilding, Dur-Kurigalzu's remains endure as testimony to Kassite innovations in architecture. And yet the Kassites themselves remain elusive. Unlike the Sumerians, who left behind myths, hymns, and detailed administrative records, or the Babylonians, who preserved epics and astronomical texts, the Kassites left little written tradition of their own. What survives are mostly royal inscriptions, boundary stones known as kuduru, and scattered references in later chronicles. They ruled Babylonia for centuries, stabilizing a land fractured by earlier turmoil. Yet their cultural identity seems muted, absorbed into the traditions of the people they governed. Their ziggurat at Dur-Kurigalzu is one of the few enduring voices they left to posterity, a monument of brick where words are absent. Why, then, did these rulers invest such immense labor into reviving a form with roots deep in Sumerian antiquity? Some scholars suggest that the ziggurat was a deliberate act of legitimacy. By erecting a monumental sanctuary to Enlil, the Kassite kings tied themselves to the sacred traditions of Nippur, Babylon, and Ur. They proclaimed continuity with the divine order that had governed Mesopotamia for 2 millennia. Others argue that the act was one of reverence, a sincere devotion to the gods of the land they now ruled, expressed through the most enduring architectural form available to them. Perhaps it was both, an offering of faith and a political statement carved in brick. Excavations in the early 20th century uncovered not only the towering remains of the ziggurat, but traces of the palace and city that once surrounded it. The palace complex stretched for hundreds of rooms, adorned with courtyards and halls. Fragments of painted wall plaster and decorative motifs suggest a blend of Mesopotamian and Kassite styles, though much remains enigmatic. Unlike the ziggurat, which has resisted the ravages of time, the palace has largely melted back into the earth, its mud brick walls dissolving with each passing season. What endures, stark and solemn, is the sacred tower itself, the one feature built to outlast the centuries. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the ziggurat was never just an elevated platform. It was the cosmic axis, the bond between heaven and earth, a stage on which rituals unfolded to renew the order of the universe. The choice to dedicate Dur-Kurigalzu's ziggurat to Enlil reinforces this symbolism. As the god who decreed destinies, Enlil's temple was not simply a shrine, but the very center of divine authority. For the Kassite dynasty, aligning their reign with Enlil was a claim to universal legitimacy, a declaration that their rule was woven into the fabric of cosmic order itself. Standing before the ruins today, one is struck by the sheer scale of what remains. The lower courses of the ziggurat still rise nearly 60 feet, though the upper stages have long since collapsed. From a distance, its battered mass appears almost geological, like a natural hill. Only upon closer approach does the geometry of human design reveal itself. The faint traces of stairways, the layering of bricks, the faint lines where stages once rose tier upon tier. In its weathered silence, it retains a majesty that speaks across 3,000 years. And yet the ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu poses as many questions as it answers. Why did the Kassites, a dynasty so obscure in other respects, pour such effort into one of the largest ziggurats ever constructed? Why did they choose to build it here, northwest of Babylon, rather than at the traditional spiritual centers of Nippur or Ur? Was Dur-Kurigalzu meant to replace Babylon as a Kassite capital, or to complement it with a new axis of sacred power? And why, after centuries of rule, did the Kassites leave behind so little cultural record beyond this vast structure of brick? Some historians suggest that the Kassites were less concerned with leaving behind written legacies and more invested in practical governance, maintaining stability, managing agriculture, and sustaining long reigns. Others believe that much of their record has simply been lost, eroded by the fragility of clay tablets and the accidents of excavation. But the ziggurat endures, and in its endurance, it becomes a paradox. a people remembered through architecture, but forgotten in words. As the centuries passed, the Kassite dynasty eventually waned. By the 12th century BCE, their power collapsed under foreign invasions, and their monuments fell into ruin. The Ziggurat of Ur, once the beacon of a living city, became a silent relic, standing alone in the desert as the winds stripped away its outer layers. Yet in that silence it carries a legacy. It reminds us that even the most obscure dynasties sought permanence through monuments, hoping to anchor their fleeting reigns in the eternal dialogue between earth and sky. Today, archaeologists, travelers, and villagers alike gaze upon its worn profile and wonder what stories remain buried within its bricks. Was it a center of vibrant ritual, its stairways alive with processions of priests and offerings to Enlil? Or was it already, even in its own time, a monument more symbolic than functional, a statement of Kassite power more than a place of worship? The ruins do not answer. They only endure, carrying their questions forward through time. The Ziggurat of Ur is both monument and mystery, an architectural echo of a dynasty that ruled long but spoke little. Its presence on the horizon recalls a chapter of Mesopotamian history that is at once central and obscure, enduring and forgotten. And like so many of Mesopotamia's sacred towers, it invites us to pause, to wonder, and to reflect on the fragility of memory itself. For here, in the silence of weathered brick, the voice of the Kassites still whispers, faint but insistent, across the sands of time. Chapter 11. The Temple of Eanna at Uruk, the heart of southern Mesopotamia, where the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates once nourished the first great cities of humankind, rose Uruk, the city that would become a synonym for civilization itself. Among its many wonders stood the Temple of Eanna, a sacred precinct whose stones and mud bricks once carried the weight of both myth and empire. Unlike the austere terraces of the White Temple nearby, Eanna shimmered with color, mosaics, and artistic detail, as though it were less a fortress of heaven and more a mirror of it. Here, the goddess Inanna, queen of love, of fertility, and of war, was venerated, her presence woven into every wall and threshold. To speak of Eanna is to speak not only of an architectural marvel, but of the very fabric of Mesopotamian imagination. Archaeological layers at Uruk tell a story of ceaseless renewal. The Eanna precinct was not a single structure, but a vast complex, rebuilt, expanded, and reimagined across centuries. Beneath its surviving ruins lie strata reaching deep into the Uruk period, around 3500 BCE, when the city first grew into the world's earliest metropolis. Each layer is a chapter, walls dismantled, new foundations laid, sanctuaries erected upon sanctuaries. To walk through its remains is to descend through time itself, tracing the memory of countless generations who believed this ground was touched by the goddess. Unlike the stark ziggurat platforms that would rise in later centuries, Eanna spoke a different architectural language. Its surfaces were alive with pattern and symbol. Archaeologists uncovered fragments of cone mosaics, thousands of small painted clay cones driven into mud brick walls to create geometric designs that shimmered in the desert sun. These mosaics, arranged in chevrons and diamonds, transformed bare architecture into a canvas of color. It was not enough for Eanna to stand. It had to radiate, to sing in the language of light. Such decoration has few parallels in later Mesopotamian temples, marking Eanna as a singular experiment in monumental art. The very name of Eanna, House of Heaven, invites a mythic interpretation. Inanna herself, the goddess to whom the precinct was dedicated, is among the most complex deities of the ancient Near East. She is the bringer of desire and fertility, but also the warrior who treads battlefields. She is the morning star and the evening star, her celestial body rising and descending with a rhythm that haunted early astronomers. In myth, she descends into the underworld, stripped of her garments, only to rise again, transformed. Her cult, then, was one of movement between realms, of vertical journeys, downward into shadow, upward into light. When we look upon the multi-layered foundations of Eanna, with their suggestion of terracing and monumental steps, we must wonder, did its very architecture encode these cosmic journeys? Some scholars have argued that Eanna represents a forerunner to the ziggurat form, an early attempt at monumental elevation. Others suggest it was not a precursor but a parallel path, embodying a different vision of sacred architecture. While the White Temple at Uruk already stood upon a high platform, severe and geometric, Iana was more fluid, more ornamental, as though it sought to enchant the senses as much as to command them. Could these two neighboring sanctuaries, the White Temple for Anu, the sky god, and Iana for Inanna, the goddess of earthly passion and celestial mystery, have represented two competing visions of the divine, one austere, reaching upward in clarity, the other dazzling, drawing worshippers into a maze of colour and symbol? Archaeology has revealed that the Iana complex was not static. In the early dynastic period, new walls and courtyards were added. Later, during the reign of Uruk's great kings, monumental gates and ceremonial halls transformed the precinct into a city within the city. At its height, Iana was a sprawling, sacred district, its processional routes guiding priests, supplicants, and kings through carefully ordered spaces. Every threshold carried ritual significance. Every courtyard framed a moment of revelation. Yet beneath the grandeur lay the fragility of mud brick, demanding constant renewal. To maintain the house of heaven was to participate in an eternal act of reconstruction, echoing the cycles of death and rebirth so central to Inanna's mythology. The myths of Inanna resonate eerily with the architectural remains. In the tale of her descent, she passes through 7 gates, relinquishing a symbol of power at each one. In the ruins of Iana, archaeologists have found evidence of successive gateways, each layered upon the last. Was the temple itself a reflection of the goddess's myth? Did worshippers reenact her passage, moving inward through spaces that symbolize surrender and renewal? We cannot know with certainty, but the alignment of myth and material invites us to pause. Fragments of inscribed tablets found near the precinct further deepen the mystery. Some speak of offerings to Inanna, of hymns sung at dawn, of rituals that invoked both fertility and battle. Inanna was not a gentle goddess. Her love could be fierce, her anger devastating. The temple, with its dazzling surfaces and monumental scale, was both shrine and fortress, echoing her dual nature. Within its walls, rulers of Uruk legitimized their authority, aligning themselves with the goddess's cosmic power. To control Iana was to claim divine sanction, to wield not only earthly might, but celestial destiny. Yet the surviving ruins are elusive. What we know of Iana is fragmentary, a puzzle missing its center. Later reconstructions have obscured the earliest phases. Erosion has stripped away the color and pattern that once defined its walls. Archaeologists sketch outlines of halls and courtyards, but the living temple, its shimmering mosaics, its incense-filled chambers, its chants echoing at twilight, remains just beyond reach. The house of heaven has collapsed into earth, leaving only hints of its former brilliance. And so, the questions remain. Was Iana the missing link between early high-platform temples and the towering ziggurats that would dominate Mesopotamia? Or was it a divergent vision, one that privileged ornament, myth, and sensual experience over sheer height? Did its architects intend a cosmic symbolism, encoding Inanna's journeys between realms in brick and stone? Or are we projecting myth upon ruins that were, in their time, more pragmatic, more functional than we imagine? The silence of the ruins does not answer. It allows us only fragments, mosaic shards, wall foundations, broken tablets. Yet in these fragments, we glimpse a vision of a sacred place unlike any other in Mesopotamia. A sanctuary where art, religion, and architecture fused into something luminous. The House of Heaven was not only a building, it was a mirror of the cosmos, a stage for the drama of goddess and king, a threshold between worlds. Standing amid the eroded walls today, one might still feel the echo of that brilliance. The desert wind moves across the site, carrying with it the dust of thousands of years. Beneath the surface, unexcavated layers may still hold secrets, foundations untouched, inscriptions unread. Perhaps hidden in the soil lies the missing key to Iana's true nature. For now, we are left with fragments, and with the lingering question, what vision of the divine did Uruk's builders seek to capture in this House of Heaven? The answer hovers, unresolved, like the shimmer of heat upon the horizon, waiting perhaps for another age to rediscover it. Chapter 12. The Ziggurat of Choga-Zanbil in the plains of ancient Elam, far to the east of Mesopotamia's great river valleys, rises a structure unlike any other in the Near East. Its form is unmistakable, tier upon tier of brick climbing toward the heavens, a stair-stepped mountain of clay. And yet, unlike so many of its Mesopotamian counterparts, it has not been reduced to a flattened ruin or a mere outline traced in dust. Here, at Chogar Zanbil, the ancient Elamites left behind one of the most remarkable and best preserved ziggurats in the world. More than 3,000 years later, its silhouette still commands the horizon, a monument to a people whose identity straddled the borderlands between cultures. The Ziggurat of Chogar Zanbil was built around 1250 BCE, commissioned by King Untash-Napirisha during the height of Elamite power. Its dedication was to Inshushinak, the great god of Susa, guardian of Elamite kingship and protector of the underworld. Yet the structure itself, rising in 5 visible stages, reveals a profound borrowing from Mesopotamia. The very concept of the ziggurat, an artificial mountain, ascending layer upon layer toward the sky, was a Sumerian creation, refined in Akkad, Babylon, and Ur. For the Elamites to adopt such a form was no casual imitation. It was a declaration, carved into the land itself, that Elam stood on equal footing with its western rivals. Archaeological excavations, first undertaken in the mid-20th century by Roman Gershmen, uncovered inscribed bricks within the ziggurat. These carry the voice of Untash-Napirisha himself, invoking blessings, dedicating the sanctuary to Inshushinak, and proclaiming the construction as an act of piety and kingship. The inscriptions tell us that the king envisioned Chogar Zanbil as more than a single temple. He designed an entire sacred city, Dur Untash, with the ziggurat as its beating heart. Around it, vast walls enclosed multiple temples, shrines, and gates, many of them aligned with the cardinal directions, as though to bind the complex to the cosmic order. The ziggurat itself was built with remarkable care. Millions of mud bricks, some inscribed, were stacked into a core, while fired bricks formed the outer faces, bonded with bitumen for durability. Each of its levels once gleamed with plaster, catching the sunlight and reflecting it across the plain. From its base to its summit, the structure is estimated to have stood nearly 170 feet tall, a mountain of clay and faith that dwarfed its surroundings. Today, erosion has stripped away much of its surface, yet the 5 distinct stages still rise, preserving a vision of its original grandeur. Unlike the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, which were often the central sanctuaries of bustling cities, Chogar Zanbil stands apart. Its outer wall enclosed a vast space that was never fully occupied. Archaeologists found unfinished foundations and unused courtyards, suggesting that the complex may have been abandoned before its completion. Was the king's vision cut short by death, or was the project too ambitious for the resources of his realm? The silence of the site leaves these questions unanswered. Yet even in its unfinished state, Chogar Zanbil holds mysteries that speak to both engineering and belief. Beneath its courtyards, archaeologists discovered an elaborate system of underground water channels, carefully designed to bring fresh water into the sacred precinct. For a culture living on the margins of the arid Iranian plateau, such an innovation was more than practical. It was symbolic, ensuring that the temple of Inshushinak was nourished by the life-giving element most vital to survival. The alignment of its gates to the cardinal directions may also suggest astronomical or ritual significance, binding the ziggurat not only to the earth, but to the movements of the heavens. The question of why the Elamites chose to adopt this foreign architectural form has long intrigued historians. Some argue that it was an act of religious reverence. By building a ziggurat, the Elamites acknowledged the cosmic order long enshrined in Mesopotamian tradition, linking their gods with the great mountain-like sanctuaries of their neighbors. Others see it as a declaration of political parity. By raising a ziggurat equal in grandeur to those of Ur or Babylon, Untash-Napirisha was proclaiming that Elam was no mere periphery. It was a civilization in its own right, rivaling the centers of the Fertile Crescent. Still others suggest a more personal motive. The king, seeking to immortalize his reign, sought to create a city and a sanctuary that would endure beyond his lifetime, binding his name forever to a sacred mountain of brick. Chogar Zanbil also offers a unique glimpse into cultural exchange. The Elamites, though often overshadowed by their Mesopotamian contemporaries, were not passive imitators. Their inscriptions, their gods, and their artistic motifs retain a distinct identity, woven into the broader fabric of Near Eastern civilization. The ziggurat here is not a mere copy, but a synthesis, an Elamite reinterpretation of a Mesopotamian form, reimagined in a new landscape. As centuries passed, the sacred city of Duruntash fell into silence. Assyrian chronicles record that the site was eventually sacked by Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, its sanctuaries desecrated and its temples plundered. Yet the ziggurat endured. Stripped of its ornaments, weathered by sun and wind, it still loomed above the plain, a testament to the ambition of a king and the endurance of brick. When archaeologists uncovered it in the 20th century, they found not just ruins, but a monument still alive with presence. Today, standing before Choghazanbil, one feels the weight of its survival. Unlike Ur or Babylon, whose ziggurats exist only in fragments or reconstructions, here the ancient form remains visible in its original mass. The stairways may be broken, the upper sanctuaries gone, but the tiers still climb into the sky. It is as close as we can come to seeing what a ziggurat truly was in its time. And in its survival, it whispers of larger truths. Why do humans, across cultures and ages, seek to build mountains where none exist? Why do they raise stones and bricks toward the heavens, shaping landscapes to mirror cosmic order? At Choghazanbil, the answer is not written clearly in inscriptions, nor fully explained by archaeology. It lingers instead in the silence of its ruins, in the vast unused courtyards, in the unfinished walls that suggest a vision interrupted. Perhaps that is its final mystery. Choghazanbil is at once one of the most complete ziggurats we possess, and yet also incomplete, an enduring reminder that all human ambitions, no matter how monumental, are bound by time, mortality, and the silence that follows. Here, on the eastern horizon of Mesopotamian tradition, the sacred mountain of Untashnaparisha still rises, half Mesopotamian, half Elamite, half finished, half preserved. It stands as a threshold between worlds, and in its presence, we glimpse the way monuments outlive their makers, carrying forward questions that no age can fully resolve. Chapter 13, Ziggurats as Cosmic Mountains. In the landscapes of ancient Mesopotamia, the horizon stretched wide and flat. Endless plains, broken only by the winding of the rivers, offered no peaks, no natural heights on which the eye might rest. It was a geography defined by level ground, by expanses of clay and fertile silt, a world shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates. And yet, rising above this flatness, there appeared structures that defied the natural order. Vast towers of brick, tier upon tier, climbing skyward. These were the ziggurats. They were not mountains given by the earth. They were mountains built by human hands. To the Mesopotamians, the ziggurat was never merely a building. It was called by names charged with meaning. Itimenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, or Iker, the mountain house. Such phrases reveal that the ziggurat was not only a temple, but an axis, a point where worlds touched, heaven above, earth below, and the underworld beneath the soil, all bound together by a stair-stepped bridge of brick. The symbolism of mountains runs deep in Mesopotamian myth. The gods were often described as dwelling in distant, exalted heights. Enlil, the lord of air, resided in the great mountain of Nippur. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Humbabar was guardian of the Cedar Mountain, a cosmic range where divine powers resided. High places, always beyond the reach of ordinary men, became the natural homes of gods. Yet in the Flat River Valley, such mountains were absent. The ziggurat answered this absence. It was a created summit, a sacred geography in miniature, bringing the inaccessible heights of the gods into the midst of human settlement. Some scholars see in the ziggurat an echo of primordial memory. In creation myths, the world itself often emerged from a primeval mound rising from the waters of chaos. The Mesopotamians spoke of the Apsu, the deep, the waters beneath all things, from which life first arose. To build a ziggurat was perhaps to reenact this first moment of order, to raise land above water, to stabilize creation in baked brick. In this reading, each ziggurat was not only a temple to a particular god, but a recreation of the cosmos itself, an ever-renewed act of creation. Others interpret the ziggurat as a bridge of ritual power. The summit shrine was reserved for gods, attended only by priests and kings. Here, offerings were made, incense burned, prayers lifted skyward. It was not a place for ordinary worshippers. The populace gathered at ground-level courtyards. The very inaccessibility of the upper shrine reinforced its role. A meeting point between worlds, open only to those empowered to mediate between divine and mortal. To ascend its stairways was to journey symbolically from the human realm toward the realm of gods. There are those who suggest a more practical layer beneath the symbolism. In a land so often scarred by floods, a raised platform meant safety. Stories of deluge haunt Mesopotamian literature. The tale of Atrahasis, the flood narrative woven into the Epic of Gilgamesh. To build high, to raise sacred space above the reach of the waters, may have been both an act of devotion and a safeguard. The ziggurat, then, embodied not only mythic mountains, but memories of survival. The form itself may also have carried astronomical meaning. Many ziggurats were carefully aligned with the cardinal points, their corners or faces oriented toward north, south, east, and west. From their heights, priests could observe the rising of stars, the movement of planets, the rhythms of the heavens. In a culture where divination and astronomy were deeply intertwined, the ziggurat may have functioned as a cosmic observatory, mapping the patterns of the sky onto the ordered geometry of brick below. By ascending, one not only drew nearer to the gods, but also gained a vantage point over time itself, measured in the cycles of sun and stars. Yet what lingers most is the sense that ziggurats were ideas made tangible. They were not only monuments of clay, but embodiments of yearning. The human impulse to rise above, to build where nature did not provide, to make contact with that which lies beyond reach. In their step descent, we glimpse an archetype, the mountain as sacred center, the high place as bridge. This archetype appears across the world, in the pyramids of Egypt, in the temples of Mesoamerica, in the sacred peaks of the Andes and Himalayas. Always, humans have sought elevation as a means of communion. The Ziggurat of Mesopotamia was one of the earliest and most deliberate expressions of this universal impulse. When we look upon the ruins today, worn by time, their symbolic power still radiates. The bricks may be broken, the summits gone, yet the form remains legible. A mountain house, a bond of heaven and earth. We may never fully prove whether they were flood memorials, astronomical markers, or mythic replicas of creation's first mound. Perhaps they were all of these at once. Their ambiguity is itself part of their mystery. What is clear is that ziggurats anchored cities, not just physically, but cosmologically. To dwell in their shadow was to live at the foot of the axis mundi, the world's axis, where heaven and earth were joined. Every offering, every ritual, every ascent up their stairways reaffirmed this bond. They were not passive structures, silent lumps of clay. They were participants in the life of the cosmos, material mediators between realms, seen and unseen. In this light, the ziggurat becomes less a ruin of mud brick and more a mirror held up to humanity's oldest desire, to reach upward, to find meaning in height, to turn flat ground into sacred mountain. The people of Mesopotamia built them because the gods were said to dwell above. Yet in doing so, they also revealed something about themselves, that in every age, in every landscape, humans long to climb beyond the limits of their horizon. And so, even in ruin, the ziggurats speak. They remind us that the mountains of the spirit are not always given by nature. They are built patiently, brick by brick, out of earth, faith, and the unquenchable human will to touch the sky. Chapter 14. Cuneiform. Inscriptions and builder kings, among the scattered ruins of Mesopotamia, where the desert wind sweeps across broken bricks and collapsed walls, the voices of kings still whisper. Their words are not carved in marble or etched into imperishable stone, but pressed into the pliant flesh of clay. It is in these small tablets, hardened by fire and accident, that the great monuments of antiquity survive most clearly. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, towering stairways between heaven and earth, are today little more than eroded mounds. Yet through the medium of cuneiform inscriptions, the ambitions of their builders endure. Ambitions spoken in the first person, in the voices of rulers who sought to bind their names to eternity. It is from these texts that we learn of Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, in the 21st century BCE. His inscriptions boast of the great ziggurat he raised to Nana, the moon god, a structure of mud brick and baked brick bound with bitumen, towering in the heart of the city. His words are formulaic, yet emphatic. He did not merely build, he established foundations for the gods, securing cosmic order through architecture. Ur-Nammu's successors, from Shulgi to Nabopolassar to Nebuchadnezzar Besu, repeated the same refrain across centuries, that to build or rebuild a ziggurat was to align the kingdom with divine will. But these inscriptions must be read with caution. They are not objective records, but instruments of royal memory. Again and again, the same phrases appear. I laid its foundations on ancient ground. I restored what had fallen into ruin. I built for the delight of my God. Such formulas blur fact and rhetoric. Did the kings truly complete the monumental works they claimed, or were they inscribing aspirations into clay, hoping that words alone might secure the perception of greatness? For archaeologists, the task is delicate, comparing bricks, foundations, and ruins against the self-proclaimed victories of rulers who may have exaggerated their achievements. The texts often speak of ancient foundations, a phrase both mysterious and revealing. When Nabopolassar of Babylon, in the late 7th century BCE, set his hand to the restoration of the great Ziggurat et Menanke, he claimed he was rebuilding upon primeval ruins, structures so old that their original builders were unknown even to him. This admission suggests that many of the grand projects of Mesopotamian kings were not fresh creations, but resurrections of forgotten works. Beneath each new layer of brick, there may already have lain centuries of history, older foundations upon which later rulers imposed their own authority. Thus, the ziggurat becomes a palimpsest, an accumulation of dynasties, each asserting that they alone restored the cosmic ladder to its rightful form. Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned in the 6th century BCE, left some of the most detailed inscriptions. He describes raising et Menanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, to unprecedented heights, binding its bricks with bitumen, crowning it with gleaming stone. His words ring with grandeur. A tower reaching the skies, a dwelling fit for the gods themselves. Yet archaeology reveals a quieter truth, that much of what Nebuchadnezzar claimed may have been symbolic, a statement of aspiration rather than completion. Scholars debate whether the ziggurat truly reached the dizzying dimensions described, or whether his inscription was as much myth as record. This tension between inscription and ruin opens a space of uncertainty. Were the kings exaggerating to project their power across time, or were they describing monuments that have simply not survived the millennia of erosion, conquest, and neglect? The silence of the bricks cannot answer. Instead, modern scholarship must sift carefully between hyperbole and possibility, testing the king's words against the fragmentary evidence of mud and clay. Inscriptions also reveal the deep intertwining of politics and religion. To build a ziggurat was not merely an act of devotion, it was a claim to legitimacy. A king who raised or restored the stairway of the gods demonstrated his worthiness to rule. His building works were visible proof that he was the chosen servant of the divine. Without such monuments, authority was fragile. With them, it appeared anchored in heaven itself. In this way, the ziggurat was both a religious offering and a political statement, a monument of mud brick that bound together the city, the gods, and the throne. The language of the inscriptions reinforces this duality. Kings do not describe themselves as mere builders, but as caretakers of cosmic order. They make firm the bond between heaven and earth. They delight the heart of the god. They restore the great ladder of the world. These phrases transform construction into myth. A pile of bricks becomes a cosmic axis, a channel for divine presence. The king, in turn, becomes more than a ruler. He is a mediator between the human and the divine. Yet in these same inscriptions, we catch glimpses of anxiety. The repeated references to ancient foundations suggest that even as kings proclaimed their building works, they were acutely aware of their transience. The ziggurat, built of perishable clay, was destined to decay. To rebuild was to acknowledge impermanence, to participate in an endless cycle of ruin and restoration. Each inscription is thus both boast and confession. The king may have built for eternity, but he knew his work would crumble, and his name would need to be spoken again by future generations. Modern excavations at Ur, Babylon, and other sites have uncovered brick after brick stamped with royal names. Each stamp is a whisper from a king, a reminder of presence. And yet, when these bricks are found scattered, collapsed, eroded, they also testify to absence. The inscriptions remain legible, but the structures they described have dissolved. This contrast between the endurance of words and the fragility of buildings is haunting. It is through the tablets and stamped bricks that we remember the ziggurats, not through their intact survival. The words have outlasted the very monuments they were meant to describe. The layering of inscriptions across centuries complicates the picture further. A later king might inscribe his name upon older bricks, reusing them in his own projects. In doing so, he erased the past while simultaneously preserving it. To rebuild upon ancient foundations was not only a practical choice, it was a symbolic gesture of continuity, an attempt to bind oneself to the lineage of rulers who came before. But it also raises questions for us. Whose monument are we truly looking at? Does the surviving ziggurat belong to Ur-Nammu, or to Nebuchadnezzar, or to a forgotten king whose name was overwritten? The very stones are contested, bearing multiple voices layered across time. Thus, the inscriptions both illuminate and obscure. They give us names, dimensions, purposes, but they also blur fact with rhetoric, history with propaganda. They present the ziggurat as an eternal structure, a link between earth and heaven, yet archaeology reveals their fragility. They claim continuity, yet conceal erasures. The truth of the ziggurats lies somewhere between the silence of their bricks and the clamour of the kings who claimed them. And so we are left with questions. How many ziggurats truly stood in their prime, gleaming and monumental? How many existed only as dreams inscribed in clay, words of power more enduring than the fragile mud of construction? Were the kings chroniclers of reality or poets of aspiration? In the end, the tablets remain, silent yet eloquent, their wedge-shaped marks preserving the ambitions of rulers long gone. To read them is to hear the echoes of builder kings who sought to tether their names to eternity. But to stand among the ruins is to feel the dissonance, the vast distance between inscription and reality, between boast and ruin. The truth lies somewhere in that tension, unresolved, waiting in the silence of the ancient mounds. Chapter 15. The role of the priesthood. At the heart of Mesopotamia's sacred towers stood not only bricks, nor kings, nor gods, but men. Men whose power was woven into ritual, secrecy, and interpretation. The priesthood of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and beyond shaped the ziggurats into living instruments of belief. Their authority was subtle, yet immense, for they held the keys to the mysteries performed atop the terraced heights. Without them, the towers would have been mute monuments of clay. With them, they became bridges between earth and the divine. The ordinary inhabitant of Ur, or Nippur, never saw the inner sanctum of a ziggurat. From below, citizens would glimpse only processions, priests ascending in long white garments, carrying offerings of bread, dates, or lambs. At times, the smoke of incense rose from the summit shrine, curling into the air, visible to all but accessible to none. The people stood in courtyards at the base, their prayers cast upward, their eyes lifted toward a world deliberately kept beyond reach. The ziggurat was a stage, and the priesthood the guardians of its mysteries. At the topmost terrace lay the cella, the sacred room where the god was believed to dwell. Archaeological traces, altars, offering tables, channels for libations, suggest rituals of both nourishment and purification. Texts describe daily offerings of food and drink, placed before the divine statue, as if sustaining the gods themselves. In hymns, the gods are implored to eat the pure bread, drink the clear water, a symbolic act affirming the bond between human and divine. Yet it was the priests who enacted these rites, unseen by the crowd, and in doing so, they preserved the invisible thread of communication that bound heaven and earth. The hierarchy of access was deliberate. Kings could order the building of the ziggurats, but it was the priests who defined their meaning. Clay tablets from Uruk and Babylon describe the specialized roles within temple staff. Shangu priests, who performed sacrifices, Gudu priests who tended purity rites, and singers who intoned hymns before the gods. Each role was bound by rules of purity and restriction, layers of initiation that mirrored the physical steps of the tower. Just as the shrine at the top was elevated above the city, the knowledge of the priesthood was elevated above the understanding of the people. This exclusivity raises questions. Was it a matter of devotion or a mechanism of control? The rituals performed high above the ground were not witnessed, only reported. The faithful relied on the priesthood to mediate unseen worlds. Authority, in this context, was not derived from force, but from knowledge withheld. The mystery of the gods became a stage for human power. The priesthood also shaped time itself. Inscriptions from Nippur describe their role in determining festival days, calculating the movements of stars and interpreting omens. By reading the heavens and aligning the calendar, they synchronized society with the rhythms of the cosmos. In this way, the ziggurat was not only a monument of faith, but a clock tower of destiny, its terraces aligned with stars and solstices, its rituals tied to cycles of agriculture and kingship. The priests alone interpreted these signs, presenting them as decrees of the divine. Was this astronomy or theology, or both, inseparably fused? At times, their role bordered on political arbitration. Kings were sanctioned through rituals at temple complexes. A ruler who ignored the priesthood risked delegitimization. For Enlil, Anu, or Marduk would not favor one whose name was not spoken in temple prayers. Clay tablets describe rulers offering rich donations to priests, grain, silver, livestock, not only to honor the gods, but to secure the loyalty of those who mediated divine will. In this fragile balance, the ziggurat was not only a sacred tower, but a throne room of cosmic politics. Consider the annual New Year festival of Babylon. The statue of Marduk was carried in procession, ascending toward the ziggurat's shrine. Here, the high priest performed rituals affirming the king's divine right to rule. The drama was more than religious ceremony. It was theater of legitimacy. By standing at the summit, by sharing proximity to the god, the king's rule was fused with cosmic order. Yet this access was possible only through priestly sanction, a choreography designed to remind both ruler and people where ultimate authority resided. Even the architecture itself reflects priestly design. Archaeological studies suggest that stairways were often built not for mass use, but for ritual processions by limited participants. The steepness, the orientation, the symmetry of terraces all hint at carefully choreographed movement. From base to summit, the ascent was symbolic, a reenactment of humanity's climb toward the divine. But only the priests and chosen rulers could complete the journey. The people remained below, their role one of witness and faith. The secrecy of the summit has left archaeology with silence. Few records describe in detail what occurred within the upper shrines. Were there night vigils? Sacred marriages enacted between priestesses and kings in the presence of divine statues? Or rites lost entirely to time, performed in whispered words? Never set in clay? The scarcity of evidence is itself telling. The priesthood guarded its knowledge closely, ensuring that the heart of the ziggurat remained impenetrable, even across millennia. In this silence, speculation blooms. Some scholars suggest the ziggurat rituals encoded astronomical observation, with priests climbing terraces to chart stars. Others imagine dream incubation, nights of sleep within sacred chambers to receive visions from the gods. Still others wonder if chemical incenses or psychoactive plants enhance the altered states sought in ritual. Yet without records, these remain shadows, possibilities glimpsed but never confirmed. The mystery holds, and so the role of the priesthood endures in absence. Their voices remain in hymns and prayers, their authority etched in administrative tablets, but the precise drama of their rites is largely lost, perhaps deliberately. Perhaps, in keeping with their ancient charge, they ensured that the secrets of heaven remained confined to those permitted to climb the sacred mountain. As the winds scour the ruined ziggurats today, we can still sense the structure of power they embodied. Kings built, but priests interpreted. Citizens prayed, but priests enacted. The gods were distant, yet priests stood at the threshold, mediators between the seen and unseen. Each ziggurat was therefore not only an axis between heaven and earth, but between human and human, an architecture of hierarchy, reinforced by ritual. To walk among their ruins now is to feel both presence and absence, the towering remains of mud brick, and the silence of rituals that will never be heard again. The priesthood's role has vanished with the centuries, but the memory of their exclusivity still lingers in the structure itself. For what was a ziggurat, if not a mountain crowned with mystery, guarded by those who alone could ascend? And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the priesthood, Not the details of their rites, nor the lists of their offerings, but the silence they left behind, an unanswered question that keeps the towers alive in imagination, even when their bricks crumble into dust. Chapter 16, Ziggurats and the Stars Inn. The silence of the Mesopotamian night. The desert sky unfurls in unbroken clarity. Long before modern cities dimmed the heavens with their artificial glow, the stars above Sumer and Babylon shone with astonishing intensity. To the ancients, this canopy was not a backdrop, but a living map of the divine. Every constellation was a god, every wandering planet a sign, every eclipse a message written in fire across the vault of the night. And at the heart of this relationship between earth and sky stood the ziggurat, a man-made mountain, rising tier by tier, as though crafted to meet the gaze of the heavens. The great Ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, was dedicated to Nana, the moon god. Its orientation is striking. The four corners are aligned with the cardinal points, a precision that is difficult to dismiss as accidental. Standing atop its summit shrine, priests of the moon could have watched the waxing and waning crescent as it rose and fell across the horizon. The stairways climbing its terraces seem to echo the path of the moon itself, ascending into fullness, descending into shadow. It is here that the idea of ziggurats as observatories gains its strength. Not merely temples of brick, but instruments for charting the rhythms of the sky. Babylon, centuries later, continued this celestial vision. The legendary Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth, was dedicated to Marduk, a god whose power was entwined with the cosmic order. Ancient texts, including fragments of the Enuma Elish, speak of a universe divided, measured, and ordered by divine decree. From the summit of Babylon's ziggurat, one might imagine priests watching the procession of planets, especially the sun and Venus, whose appearances were tied to rituals and omens. Babylonian astronomers are credited with some of the earliest systematic records of eclipses, lunar phases, and planetary cycles. Could these observations have been made from the raised vantage points of the ziggurats, above the noise and bustle of the city, closer to the silence of the stars? Cuneiform tablets suggest that temples were often conceived as reflections of the sky. In some hymns, gods are described as constellations, their movements across the heavens mirrored by festivals and ceremonies on earth. The ziggurat, then, was more than a sacred dwelling. It was a bridge, uniting cosmic time with human ritual. Each tier may have represented a layer of the heavens, with the summit shrine serving as the point of contact between mortal priests and celestial deities. To ascend the ziggurat was not only to rise above the city, but to climb symbolically into the very structure of the universe. Astronomy and religion were inseparable in Mesopotamia. The priests of these early cities were both observers of the sky and interpreters of divine will. When an eclipse darkened the moon, it was not a neutral event. It was an omen, often a dire one, requiring elaborate rituals to shield the king and the city from divine wrath. The ziggurat, with its elevated vantage, offered a stage from which these events could be witnessed, interpreted, and woven into the rhythms of society. From its summit, the boundaries between empirical observation and spiritual interpretation dissolved, leaving only a unified vision of the cosmos. And yet, the evidence is elusive. Modern archaeologists debate whether ziggurats were truly designed as observatories, or whether their alignments were the natural outcome of practical concerns. The cardinal orientations could reflect a symbolic ordering of space rather than precise astronomical intent. The lack of surviving instruments or unambiguous records leaves us in a realm of speculation. Still, the repeated emphasis on cosmic order in Mesopotamian texts suggests that the builders saw no distinction between architecture and astronomy, between brick and star. To them, the very act of construction was already a cosmic alignment. Consider the 7 levels that some ziggurats are believed to have possessed. Later, Mesopotamian and Babylonian traditions often associated 7 with the planets visible to the naked eye. The Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each tier of the tower may have symbolized one of these celestial powers, binding the movements of the heavens into the architecture of Earth. Whether this symbolism was literal or later ascribed, the resonance is unmistakable. The ziggurat becomes not only a mountain but a cosmic ladder, each ascent a step through the planetary spheres toward the throne of the gods. From the ruins of Ur, Babylon, and Borsippa, archaeologists recover fragments of inscriptions that hint at this vision. Nebuchadnezzar II, in his accounts of rebuilding Etemenanki, speaks of a tower that binds heaven and earth. The phrase carries both a physical and a cosmic weight, suggesting that the monument was not simply a dwelling place for a god, but a structure that mirrored the very fabric of the universe. Whether literal or symbolic, such words tie the ziggurat inseparably to the stars. One must also remember the role of time. In Mesopotamia, time was measured not by mechanical clocks, but by celestial cycles, the rising of Sirius, the phases of the moon, the solstices and equinoxes, all provided a framework for agricultural life and religious ritual. The ziggurat, positioned at the center of the city, may have embodied this calendar, a reminder in brick of the sky's enduring rhythm. Priests ascending its terraces could have noted the heliacal rising of a star, the first glimpse of Venus at dawn, the shadow of the sun at solstice. These observations were then inscribed onto clay tablets, transforming fleeting moments in the heavens into enduring records on earth. And so, we are left with an image, high above the streets of Ur. A priest stands upon the summit of the ziggurat, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Around him, the city sleeps, but above him, the stars blaze with messages. He holds no telescope, no modern instrument, only the naked eye, sharpened by years of devotion. To him, the sky is a scroll of the gods, each movement a word, each alignment a sentence. He watches, records, and interprets, translating the infinite into the rhythms of ritual and law. Today, standing before the eroded remains of these temples, it is difficult to recover that vision. The terraces are worn down, the summit shrines gone, the mosaics and colors vanished into dust. The sky too is altered, its brilliance dimmed by the haze of modern light. Yet if one allows silence to settle, if one imagines the ziggurat restored in its prime, the connection becomes almost tangible. The structure points upward still, its geometry echoing the order of the heavens. Its ruins a reminder of the gaze that once rose from its summit toward the stars. Was this intentional design a conscious attempt to mirror the cosmos? Or is it our own projection, reading celestial meaning into ruins whose builders may have had more immediate concerns? The evidence refuses to settle. What remains is the possibility, the haunting suggestion that these towers were more than monuments of mud brick, that they were instruments of cosmic dialogue, calendars of earth and sky. And so the debate endures. Were the ziggurats observatories, or were they simply temples, later imagined into cosmic ladders by poets and priests? The answer is suspended in the night sky itself, unreachable yet luminous, like the stars that once guided ancient eyes from the heights of Mesopotamia's sacred towers. Chapter 17. The Enuma, Elish, and the Cosmic Foundation. In the dim silence of clay tablets, etched by careful hands more than 3,000 years ago, a story emerges. It begins not with men, nor with kingdoms, but with the birth of the cosmos itself. The Babylonians called it the Enuma Elish, when on high, a title not of glory, but of origin, for it recalls a time before heaven and earth were divided, when only primordial waters swirled in endless darkness. From this watery abyss came two beings, Apsu, the sweet fresh waters, and Tiamat, the salt seas. Their mingling gave rise to the younger gods, and in their conflict, the universe was set into motion. The Enuma Elish is more than a myth. It is a blueprint, a text that fuses theology with architecture, describing not only how the heavens and earth were ordered, but how that order was to be anchored within the cities of men. For at its heart lies an enduring theme, the establishment of a dwelling, a foundation, a cosmic temple where divine and human realms could meet. The drama unfolds with violence. Tiamat, the oceanic chaos, rises against the younger gods, summoning a host of monstrous beings, serpents, dragons, and storm creatures. But Marduk, son of Ea, steps forward as champion. Armed with a net, a bow, and an unyielding will, he captures Tiamat in his snare. With an arrow, he pierces her heart, and from her divided body, he fashions the very structure of the world, her corpse becoming heaven above and earth below. The act of creation is an act of cutting, of separation, of order imposed upon chaos. Yet Marduk's work does not end there. From the blood of a defeated rebel god, Kingu, he fashions humanity, to bear the burden of labor, to maintain the offerings, and to keep the rhythms of worship. In return, the gods promise rest, But even this act is incomplete without a dwelling, a cosmic foundation that mirrors the heavens themselves. The Enuma Elish speaks of it directly. Marduk constructed a shrine, a sagala, a palace like the heavens. There he established his seat, and the other gods took their places. Sagala, the great temple of Babylon, dedicated to Marduk. Its name meant House of the Raised Head, and it stood in the shadow of the colossal ziggurat, Etemenanki. To the Babylonians, these were not mere buildings. They were reflections of the cosmos itself. Just as Marduk split the universe into layers, the temple and its towering ziggurat recreated the same divisions in brick and bitumen, heaven above, earth below, and the foundation that bound them. Archaeologists have long drawn the connection between this mythic imagery and the architecture of Mesopotamian ziggurats. Etemenanki, whose very name translates as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, was no ordinary structure. Rising in step terraces, it was said to reach nearly 90 meters into the sky, a mountain of man-made stone in the flat Mesopotamian plain. To climb its levels was to move symbolically from earth toward heaven, each step echoing Marduk's cosmic ordering. But how much of this is deliberate myth made manifest? And how much is the projection of modern imagination? That question lingers. The texts do not always align with the ruins, and the ruins often tell stories that texts leave silent. What is clear is that the act of building itself was sacred. To lay a foundation was to reenact creation. The Babylonians believed that the first brick of a temple was more than stone. It was a cosmic anchor, a stabilizing point where divine power could enter the material world. In one ritual, priests buried foundation deposits beneath temple corners, inscribed tablets, miniature tools, figurines of gods. These were not decorations, they were spells in clay, hidden beneath the structure, ensuring that the dwelling above was tied to the cosmic order below. To stand within a temple was to inhabit the center of the world, the place where heaven and earth met in fragile balance. The Enuma Elish was recited every new year during the festival of Akitu. For 12 days, the story of creation was spoken aloud, reactivating the cosmos itself. As priests chanted the words, the myth became a living force. The city's ruler was humbled, stripped of his regalia, struck across the face by the high priest of Marduk. In that moment, kingship was dissolved, only to be re-established as the story unfolded. Order was renewed from chaos, just as in the time of Marduk. Here, myth and stone merged seamlessly. The ziggurat, towering over the city, embodied the divine foundation, while the ritual retelling of the Enuma Elish infused the bricks with renewed power. Babylon was not merely a city of men, it was the axis of creation, the earthly mirror of the heavenly palace. But even this clarity blurs upon closer inspection. Was the Enuma Elish originally a Babylonian composition, designed to exalt Marduk above older deities? Or was it drawn from deeper Sumerian roots, where Enlil and Ninurta once held the roles of storm gods and cosmic builders? Scholars still debate, tracing echoes of Tiamat in the Sumerian goddess Namu, or in the watery abyss called the Abzu. The myth seems less like a fixed tale and more like a palimpsest, rewritten by each age to suit its divine kings and their temples. What remains undeniable is the intimate connection between cosmology and construction. To the people of Mesopotamia, to build was not simply to erect walls. It was to participate in the very acts of creation. Every foundation trench cut into the soil replayed Marduk's slaying of chaos. Every brick laid was an echo of the god's cosmic decree. The city itself became a living scripture, with ziggurats and temples as its verses. Fragments of this worldview survive in scattered cuneiform tablets, their edges worn, their lines broken. One text speaks of Etemenanki as a stairway to the heavens. Another describes how its summit served as a meeting point for the gods. Later writers, Herodotus among them, would repeat stories of a great tower in Babylon, though filtered through Greek imagination. Even the biblical tale of the Tower of Babel seems to carry an echo of this same ziggurat, transformed into a story of hubris and divine punishment. Yet the ruins of Etemenanki lie silent today, reduced to a mound of baked clay, its once grand terraces lost to erosion and conquest. Alexander the Great, in his campaigns, ordered it restored, but even his empire could not revive its ancient glory. What survives instead is the memory, the intertwining of myth and stone, preserved in the fragile lines of the Enuma Elish. To read this text is to enter a world where the cosmos is a temple, and the temple is the cosmos. The heavens are not distant. They are mirrored in the ziggurats' ascending levels. The earth is not profane. It is the lower chamber of a sacred palace. The very act of living in Babylon was to dwell at the navel of creation, where divine order had once subdued chaos and still held it at bay. And yet, questions linger. Was the Enuma Elish merely a political manifesto, elevating Marduk as supreme to consolidate Babylon's power? Or was it a genuine echo of an older primordial memory, carried forward through countless generations? Did the Babylonians truly see their ziggurats as cosmic replicas? Or do we impose that meaning in hindsight, weaving myth and ruin together in our own search for coherence? The answers remain elusive, but in that uncertainty lies the very essence of Mesopotamian thought. For them, myth was never separate from stone, nor stone from myth. To build was to remember, and to remember was to build. The foundations of their temples were the foundations of the cosmos itself, holding back the chaos that always threatened to return. And so, when we read the Enuma Elish today, when we trace its words across the cracked surfaces of clay tablets, we are not merely encountering a story, we are touching the very blueprint of an ancient worldview, one that saw creation not as a single moment in the distant past, but as a continual act, renewed in ritual, in festival, and in the silent endurance of brick upon brick. Like the ziggurat rising toward the heavens, the Enuma Elish offers us a path, not an answer, but a direction, a reminder that in the ancient mind, the line between myth and foundation stone was never drawn, and perhaps it still is not. Chapter 18. The Epic of Gilgamesh and Sacred Foundations. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins not with a battle, not with a quest, but with an invitation. It calls the listener, the reader, the seeker, to look upon the walls of Uruk and to behold them, massive, enduring, eternal. The epic tells us that these walls were not the work of men alone. Their very foundations, it says, were laid by the 7 sages, those semi-mythic beings who emerge again and again in Mesopotamian lore, credited with shaping order out of primordial chaos. It is here, in this opening gesture, that myth and masonry meet. The stones and mud bricks of Uruk's walls are no longer mere construction. They become vessels of memory, embedded with divine instruction. The epic situates itself not only in the realm of storytelling, but in a physical, archaeological world, a city with gates, towers, and boundaries that still leave their imprint on the Mesopotamian plain. Archaeologists who have walked the ruins of Uruk find themselves echoing the words of Gilgamesh's prologue. They measure ancient bricks, each stamped with the mark of a king. They trace outlines of temples and palaces, laid out in symmetry that suggests more than utility. And yet the text insists on something deeper, that the true foundation lies below. In that space where human labor meets sacred direction, the 7 sages, the Apkallu, are never described as simple mortals. They are part man, part fish, emissaries from the deep, associated with the god of wisdom, Ea. They emerge from the waters of creation to gift humanity with knowledge of architecture, agriculture, and ritual. To say that they laid the foundations of Uruk is to imply that the very city itself was a reflection of cosmic order, a planned alignment between earth and heaven. But what were these foundations the epic speaks of? Some scholars suggest the word is meant quite literally. The great retaining walls of Uruk, built in mud brick and stone, layered over centuries, the work of thousands of hands. Others whisper that the foundations could refer instead to temples, to the Iana precinct, the sacred district of Uruk, where Inanna's ziggurat once rose. The epic does not distinguish, and perhaps it is not meant to. For in Mesopotamia, the city itself was a temple, and the temple, in turn, was a city. The Epic of Gilgamesh is suffused with imagery of journeys, upward, downward, and outward. Gilgamesh climbs the walls of Uruk, he travels to the cedar forest, he descends to the underworld, and he reaches for the heavens in his search for immortality. These movements mirror the very structure of Mesopotamian sacred architecture. The ziggurat, with its ascending tiers, invited the worshipper to rise from the dust of the plain toward the divine heights. At the same time, its deep foundations, often built with carefully consecrated ritual deposits, symbolized an anchoring into the underworld. Each step of Gilgamesh's journey can be read as an echo of this architecture. To ascend is to seek the gods. To descend is to confront death and the hidden forces beneath the earth. The ziggurat embodies this duality, a mountain raised by human hands, standing as the axis between realms. In the cedar forest, Gilgamesh faces Humbaba, guardian of a realm forbidden to mortals. The forest itself may reflect distant memory of Lebanon's cedars, the towering trees once harvested for the timbers that built Mesopotamian temples and palaces. But symbolically, the forest is a vertical world, a place of ascent, where the hero dares to confront that which towers beyond him. And in killing Humbaba, Gilgamesh oversteps, disrupting the sacred balance. The journey downward that follows, into grief, into mortality, into the very shadow of death, is inevitable. The epic's final image returns us to Uruk. Gilgamesh, who has failed to seize eternal life, finds meaning in the walls, the very same walls that opened the poem. The cycle closes. What endures is not the body of the king, but the foundations laid by divine sages, the structures that root human memory into Earth itself. For archaeologists, this framing is tantalizing. Could the epic be preserving a faint memory of real construction? The great projects of kings who, in their inscriptions, claimed to be chosen by gods, instructed by dreams, guided by omens. When the epic speaks of foundations, is it recounting a literal act of architecture, transfigured through myth, or is it presenting a timeless metaphor? That human achievement only endures when it is rooted in divine wisdom. In the ruins of Uruk, traces of this blending remain. Excavations at the Iana precinct have revealed layers of temples, rebuilt and expanded across centuries. Beneath them, archaeologists have discovered deposits of foundation tablets, small inscribed stones and figurines placed deliberately into the earth, meant to consecrate the building, to bind it to cosmic order. The epic's insistence on foundations resonates with this practice. It reminds us that in Mesopotamia, the unseen base was as sacred as the structure above. Even the very bricks carried symbolic weight. Kings ordered their names pressed into wet clay before firing, embedding their authority into every layer of the city. To walk the walls of Uruk was to walk upon words, upon incantations, upon the weight of dynasties. Gilgamesh's invitation to behold those walls is not just pride. It is an act of remembrance, a call to recognize human labor sanctified by divine instruction. And yet, mystery lingers. The 7 sages are said to have vanished back into the sea, returning to the realm of their birth. Their work remains, but their presence is fleeting. In the epic, the foundations are ascribed to them, but the structures themselves are credited to kings. This overlap of myth and memory leaves us in a twilight space. Were the sages ancient ancestors, mythologized into semi-divine form? Were they symbols for the first builders, whose knowledge appeared so sudden it seemed supernatural? Or are they reminders that behind every human achievement lies an inheritance from forces we can no longer name? The Epic of Gilgamesh, often called the world's first great literature, is more than story. It is a lens through which Mesopotamian people remembered their own beginnings. Through poetry, they encoded not only the drama of kings, but the sacred geometry of their world. The ascent and descent of Gilgamesh are not only adventures, they are the movements of ritual, of temple staircases, of ziggurats rising against the horizon. Each reading brings us back to Uruk's walls, to their hidden foundations. We are asked again and again to behold them, not only as ruins, not only as archaeology, but as symbols of the human longing to endure. For in the epic's vision, the bricks are more than clay. They are memory, they are myth. They are the threshold where earth and heaven touch. And perhaps that is why, though the walls of Uruk crumble, the story remains, a sacred foundation laid not in brick, but in words, passed down across millennia, surviving fire, flood, and the erosion of time. We return then to the opening image. The city rises on the plain, its walls radiant in the dawn. The sages stand in shadow, half seen, whispering their gifts of knowledge before vanishing into the waters. And Gilgamesh, both king and seeker, walks among the gates, caught between mortality and eternity, between the clay of the earth and the heights of the sky. The epic leaves us not with answers, but with the lingering echo of that invitation. To look upon the walls, to descend into their foundations, to wonder what was built and what was remembered, and to feel, beneath the weight of history, the silence of all that has been lost. Chapter 19. Flood Myths and Elevated Sanctuaries. Long before the first bricks of ziggurats were pressed and set under the Mesopotamian sun, the land itself carried memories of water, unpredictable, ruinous and divine. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of cities was also the stage of floods. Annual inundations nourished the soil, but at times they raged with destructive force, drowning villages, sweeping away crops, leaving silence where life had thrived. In such a fragile world, myths of deluge were more than stories. They were cultural memories, imprinted upon generations who lived forever at the mercy of rivers. Among the oldest of these is the Atrahasis epic, dating to the 18th century BCE, though its themes likely reach back into even deeper antiquity. In its verses, the gods decide to flood the world, weary of humankind's clamour. Atrahasis, warned by the god Enki, builds a vessel and survives the waters that consume all else. The imagery is stark, divine anger expressed in torrents, humanity nearly erased, salvation resting upon foresight and elevation above the flood. Centuries later, the Epic of Gilgamesh would echo this tale through the figure of Utnapishtim, survivor of another cataclysm. He too was instructed to build a great boat, to gather his family and seed of all living things, and to ride above the waters that destroyed mankind. After the flood receded, his vessel rested upon a distant mountain, its peak emerging above the waters of chaos. This theme, the refuge of height against destructive waters, runs like a current not only through Mesopotamian epics, but through later traditions. The mountains of Ararat in the Hebrew Bible, the sacred peaks of other mythologies across the ancient world. Against this backdrop, the ziggurat takes on a new dimension. Rising from flat plains, built tier upon tier, they stood like man-made mountains in a land without them. The Sumerians called them Ekur, mountain house, or Duranki, bond of heaven and earth. Their symbolism is clear. They reached upward, bridging sky and ground. But might they also have been shaped by memory, echoes of survival, of salvation found in elevation? In a landscape vulnerable to deluge, the raised sanctuary may have represented not only a throne for the gods, but a monument to endurance. Archaeologists point out that Mesopotamia's geography offered few natural refuges. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile Valley is bounded by stone highlands, Mesopotamia is wide, low, and exposed. Floods could not be escaped by climbing to safety. One could only endure or perish. Perhaps this absence of natural peaks seeded the human desire to create artificial ones. The ziggurat thus became not just a sacred axis, but a constructed memory of survival, a reassurance in brick that humanity could reach above the waters if chaos returned. Though no surviving inscription explicitly states this purpose, the parallels are compelling. The myth of Atrahasis describes a god commanding refuge from a flood. The myth of Utnapishtim recalls a vessel lifted to mountain heights, and in clay and bitumen, the ziggurat rises, a mountain made by men, a platform that endures above mud and river. The symbolism of safety and elevation may have been implicit, so deeply woven into cultural memory that it needed no explanation. Some scholars have proposed that ziggurats encoded multiple layers of meaning at once. They were temples. Yes, platforms for rituals, sanctuaries for the gods. They were political statements, symbols of power and legitimacy. But they may also have been memory objects, monumental reminders of humanity's fragility and resilience. To climb their stairs could be to reenact myth itself, the ascent from chaos to safety, from destruction to renewal. Each offering placed at the summit might echo the gratitude of survivors who once endured a flood that erased all others. Later traditions reinforce this reading. The biblical Tower of Babel, though cast in the language of pride and punishment, stands in proximity to flood narratives. Noah's Ark, lifted above the deluge, becomes the mirror of Utnapishtim's vessel, and the Ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, remembered as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, may itself have resonated with both themes, a tower of ascent and a foundation above waters. Was this layering of myth accidental, or the persistence of a deeper cultural memory that spanned civilizations? Practical considerations may have also played their part. By raising temples on high platforms, priests and rulers safeguarded shrines from the damp soil, from sudden floods, from the slow erosion of river silt. Engineering necessity and spiritual memory may have fused, each reinforcing the other. A shrine preserved above the reach of water was both practical and symbolic, proof that the god's dwelling was untouchable, safe from the chaos that consumed mortal dwellings. At Chogar Zanbil in Elam, at Ur, at Dur Kurigalzu, we see this fusion, monumental terraces rising far beyond the needs of ritual, as if architecture itself was a prayer for safety. Their scale surpassed necessity, suggesting that more was at play than protection from seasonal rains. These were statements carved into the horizon, visible for miles, embodying both cosmic order and the unspoken fear of collapse. The silence of archaeology leaves the question unresolved. No tablet tells us directly that ziggurats were flood refuges, nor do myths equate towers with salvation, yet the echoes between story and stone remain. Perhaps the ziggurats stood at the threshold, between myth remembered and history lived, monuments, where divine presence and human survival converged. Standing today among the weathered bricks of Ur or the eroded stages of Dur-Kurigalzu, one can almost feel that tension, the weight of ritual, the solemnity of politics, and beneath it all, the whisper of memory, of waters rising, of survival found only in height. Each crumbling stair might once have been a path upward, not only toward a god, but away from chaos. And so the ziggurat remains suspended between interpretations. Sacred mountain, cosmic axis, political stage, flood memory. Perhaps it was all of these at once, layers of meaning pressed together like the courses of mud brick that shaped its body. For in Mesopotamia, memory itself was layered, myth upon myth, flood upon flood, temple upon temple, each rising above the other, reaching for permanence in a world where permanence was always at risk. What we are left with is not certainty, but resonance, the stories of deluge and survival, the sight of towers raised against flat horizons, the enduring human instinct to climb above waters, to build a sanctuary beyond the reach of chaos. In their silence, the ziggurats still echo those fears, those hopes, and those ancient questions we cannot quite let go. Chapter 20, The Decline of Ziggurat Construction. By the dawn of the first millennium BCE, the skyline of Mesopotamia was changing. For centuries, the ziggurat had stood as the supreme monument of the land between rivers, an artificial mountain of clay and bitumen, binding heaven and earth. Its massive terraces had defined the sacred heart of the city, its summit shrine marking the dwelling of the god. But gradually, quietly, this tradition began to fade. Fewer new ziggurats were raised, and those that had once soared above the plains were left to crumble, sustained more by memory and ritual than by the bricklayer's craft. The great age of ziggurat building was passing into shadow. The Assyrian kings of the early first millennium inherited the legacy of Sumer and Akkad, but their gaze turned elsewhere. Their capitals, Ashur, Nimrud, Nineveh, Khorsabad, were dominated not by ziggurats, but by colossal palaces and fortified walls. Reliefs carved into alabaster celebrated military victories, lion hunts, and divine protection of the king. Architecture became theatrical, a stage for royal power rather than a ladder to the heavens. The sacred towers were not forgotten, but they were no longer the centerpieces of imperial ambition. And yet, ziggurats retained symbolic weight. In Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned in the 6th century BCE, proclaimed in his inscriptions that he had restored Etemenanki, the legendary house of the foundation of heaven and earth. He boasted of raising its summit to the sky, binding bricks with gleaming bitumen, and making its terraces a wonder of the world. But even these words carried the language of restoration rather than innovation. Nebuchadnezzar did not claim to have built anew, but to have revived the ancient foundations, echoing the deeds of rulers long past. This was enough. The ziggurat still functioned as a symbol of legitimacy, a reminder that the king was aligned with the gods and with the timeless traditions of Mesopotamia. Why, then, did the tradition decline? The reasons are layered, as intricate as the bricks themselves. Part of the answer lies in religion. The gods of Mesopotamia did not vanish, but their worship shifted towards sprawling temple complexes, where rituals unfolded in courtyards and halls rather than on high terraces. Priestly functions became increasingly tied to the management of temple estates, the reading of omens, and the performance of sacrifices. The ziggurat, once the focal point of ascent and descent, was no longer central to the practice of devotion. Another explanation lies in the nature of the ziggurats themselves. Built of mud brick, they demanded constant maintenance. The searing summers, the winter rains, the slow abrasion of time, all conspired to erode their massive structures. Every generation was required to renew, to repair, to rebuild. In the flourishing centuries of Sumer and Akkad, this cycle was itself a ritual, a sign of continuity. But as empires expanded and resources were drawn to distant wars, The sheer cost of sustaining these mountains of clay became prohibitive. Palaces and fortifications, built with more durable materials and serving immediate political needs, began to take precedence. The Persian conquest of Mesopotamia in the 6th century BCE accelerated this transformation. The Achaemenid kings revered the great cities of Babylon and Susa, but their architecture was of a different order. They built vast audience halls, columned palaces, and terrace platforms like Persepolis, structures that expressed a new imperial vision, one stretching across continents. The ziggurat, with its deeply local symbolism, did not align with this broader imperial identity. And so, even as ancient towers lingered in crumbling form, no new ones were raised. Still, the memory of ziggurats endured. Greek historians who visited Mesopotamia in the centuries that followed wrote of towering temples, describing them with a mixture of awe and confusion. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, spoke of a massive step tower in Babylon with a temple at its summit. Whether he saw Etemenanke in partial ruin or relied on second-hand accounts is unclear. What matters is that the image of the ziggurat survived, projected into the imagination of outsiders as one of the wonders of the world. Even in their decline, ziggurats continued to shape myth. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel, with its tale of humanity striving to build a tower that reached the heavens, is often linked to Babylon's Etemenanke. The story, preserved in Hebrew scripture and later transmitted into Christian and Islamic traditions, transformed the Mesopotamian temple into a symbol of human pride and divine judgment. Here too, the memory of the ziggurat outlasted the structure itself, reshaped into narrative and allegory. For archaeologists, the decline of ziggurat construction presents both challenge and revelation. Many of the later towers survive only as mounds of clay, their outlines faint, their layers disrupted by centuries of rebuilding. Excavations at Ur, Babylon, and other sites reveal the scars of restoration, the way later kings dug into ancient foundations, laying new bricks upon old, erasing as much as they preserved. In these ruins, the decline is visible. The ambition of earlier ages replaced by maintenance, patchwork, and eventual abandonment. And yet there is something deeply human in this decline. The ziggurat reminds us that monuments are not eternal. They require not only the labor of builders, but the belief of a people. When that belief shifts, when ritual changes, when politics demands new expressions of power, the monuments fall silent. The ziggurat's decline does not diminish its significance. It reveals its fragility, its dependence on the living faith of a culture. Today, to stand before the remains of Ur's ziggurat, restored in part during the 20th century, is to confront this paradox. The terraces still rise, their massive brickwork catching the desert sun, but around them lies emptiness. The city is gone, the rituals are silent, the priests no longer ascend the steps to the summit. What survives is memory, echoing across thousands of years, carried by texts, myths, and broken bricks. The decline of ziggurat construction, then, is not merely an end. It is a transformation, from living temple to relic, from ritual center to symbol. In their fading, ziggurats entered a new phase of existence, one in which they became not objects of devotion, but subjects of memory. Their presence lingered in stories, in scriptures, and eventually in the imagination of archaeologists who uncovered their ruins. They remind us that even the mightiest monuments are woven into the shifting fabric of time. And so we leave the ziggurats of the first millennium BCE at the threshold of silence. Their bricks crumble, their terraces collapse, their shrines vanish into dust. Yet in that silence their shadow remains. They are no longer the mountains of the gods, but they are still markers of humanity's longing for the divine. Their decline speaks not of failure, but of change, the turning of an age, the fading of one architectural vision into the dawn of another. Chapter 21. Ziggurats and the Persians. When the armies of Cyrus the Great entered Babylon in the autumn of 539 BCE, the ancient city did not fall in fire or ruin. Instead, its gates opened, and the new conqueror declared himself a restorer. The Persian king spoke not as a destroyer of temples, but as their guardian. In inscriptions carved in the old Persian tongue, and in the famous Cyrus cylinder written in Akkadian cuneiform, he presented himself as chosen by the great gods of Babylon, above all Marduk. He claimed to have returned stolen cult statues to their shrines, to have respected the sanctuaries that tied heaven and earth together. In this moment, The ziggurats, those towering monuments of Mesopotamian faith, were not erased, but absorbed into a new imperial order. The Persian kings, inheritors of vast territories stretching from Anatolia to the Indus, found themselves at the crossroads of many traditions. Among them was the legacy of Mesopotamia, whose temples and towers had defined the sacred skyline for more than 2 millennia. The great ziggurats, like Etemenanki of Babylon or the Ur ziggurat, still stood, though some in ruin, others maintained by local cults. For the Persians, these were not merely old stones, they were symbols of continuity, reminders that imperial power was only legitimate if it acknowledged the divine foundations of the lands it ruled. Cyrus and his successors thus walked a careful path. They did not build ziggurats in the ancient style, yet neither did they suppress them. Instead, they honored the sanctuaries, maintaining priesthoods and rituals, while weaving them into the fabric of their vast empire. Babylon remained a sacred city under Persian rule, its temples active, its festivals still celebrated. The Akitu, the New Year festival in which the Enuma Elish was recited, continued under Darius and Xerxes. The gods of Babylon still sat upon their thrones, even as they now stood within the shadow of the Persian king's authority. And yet, as the Persians absorbed Mesopotamian traditions, they also introduced forms of their own. At Pasargadae, the capital built by Cyrus, archaeologists uncover not a ziggurat, but a terraced garden landscape, platforms of stone upon which palaces and pavilions once rose. The air of elevation is unmistakable. Space is raised above the plain, accessible by broad stairways, designed to impress with their grandeur. The tomb of Cyrus itself stands upon a stepped platform, a stone house lifted above the earth. It is no ziggurat, yet its spirit of sacred height feels familiar. At Persepolis, founded by Darius III, the sense of elevation is made monumental. The entire palace complex rests upon a vast artificial terrace, its walls of stone rising from the plain like a man-made mountain. From afar, the terrace dominates the horizon. From within, broad flights of stairs carry the visitor upward, as if ascending toward a realm apart from ordinary life. Reliefs carved into the stone show processions of tribute bearers, delegations from across the empire, climbing toward the seated king. The imagery is not cosmic in the Babylonian sense, but political. The king enthroned upon a high place, receiving homage as though elevated above the nations. Were these Persian terraces distant echoes of the Mesopotamian ziggurat? The parallels are striking, yet the differences profound. The ziggurat was a solid mass of brick, its summit crowned with a temple for the gods. It was not entered but ascended, a stairway to the heavens themselves. The Persian terraces, by contrast, supported palaces and audience halls, places of feasting and rule. The gods were present, but so too were the kings. Some scholars suggest that the Persians drew upon the visual memory of the ziggurats, translating their sacred elevation into a new architectural language of empire. Others see the similarities as part of a broader Near Eastern tradition, the raising of sacred or royal spaces above the earth, a motif shared from Anatolia to Elam, from Mesopotamia to Iran. The debate remains unresolved. Yet, what is certain is that the concept of height, of placing the sacred upon a platform, endured. The ziggurat's essence, the bridging of earth and sky, was reframed within Persian ideology. Where the Babylonian tower had served as the dwelling of the gods, the Persian terrace became the seat of the king who ruled by divine favor. One did not cancel the other. Rather, they existed in continuity, a transformation shaped by empire. There are tantalizing traces that suggest Persian rulers did, at times, seek to restore the old Mesopotamian towers. A Babylonian text records that Xerxes repaired parts of the Eanna temple complex at Uruk. Another speaks of attempts to maintain Etemenanki, though its great bulk was by then crumbling. Alexander the Great would later attempt its rebuilding, though even he abandoned the task. The Persians, practical in their governance, may have recognized that the ancient ziggurats were both too sacred to destroy and too monumental to fully revive. Instead, they honored them in ritual, while building in their own style elsewhere. Archaeology reveals both continuity and silence. At Babylon, the remains of Etemenanki still speak of a structure that dominated the horizon, even in decline. At Persepolis, the stone terraces whisper of gatherings and ceremonies, of the king enthroned in radiance. Between them stretches a shared principle, the raised foundation, the lifted platform, the the place set apart from ordinary ground. Whether in brick or stone, whether for gods or kings, the act of elevation carried profound meaning. The Persians themselves, inheritors of the Zoroastrian faith, may have viewed height in another light. In their sacred tradition, fire temples often stood upon platforms, their flames lifted skyward, closer to the realm of Ahura Mazda. Mountains themselves were sacred, natural altars where the divine could be honored. Perhaps the Persians, encountering the Ziggurats of Mesopotamia, saw in them a reflection of their own reverence for high places. Perhaps in their terraces at Persepolis, they gave that instinct a new form. The ziggurat, then, did not vanish with the fall of Babylon. Its stones remained, its myths endured, and its essence found new life. In Persian hands, the raised temple of the gods became the raised palace of the kings. In this transformation, the boundary between divine and royal blurred, as it had so often in the ancient world. But questions remain. Was the Persian terrace a conscious imitation of the Mesopotamian ziggurat, a deliberate echo of the towers of Babylon? Or was it an independent flowering, born of a shared human desire to lift the sacred from the soil, to raise the seat of power above the plain? The silence of the stones does not answer. What we see, across centuries, is not a single form preserved, but an idea reshaped. The idea that the highest places belong to the gods, or to those who rule in their name. From the clay brick towers of Babylon to the stone terraces of Persepolis, this idea traveled, transformed, and endured. And perhaps in the ruins that remain, we can still sense the echo, the ancient instinct to build upward, to raise foundations that reach beyond the earth, toward the realms unseen. Chapter 22. The Greek Encounter with Mesopotamia. When the Greeks first crossed into the Mesopotamian plain, they did not enter a living world of temples, rites, and kingship. What they found instead were ruins, monuments already old, broken, and silent. By the 5th century BCE, when Herodotus walked among the cities of the East, many of the ziggurats had already stood for more than 1,000 years. Their bricks, once gleaming with glazed colors and adorned with ritual processions, were crumbling. The ceremonies that had once breathed life into them had long since faded into dust. What remained were shapes on the horizon, step towers rising above the flat plain. Immense in scale, mysterious in purpose, Herodotus, in his histories, described one of these wonders, the Ziggurat of Babylon. He spoke of a great tower, a vast square with winding steps circling its sides, ascending tier upon tier into the sky. For him, it was a marvel, an edifice that stood among the greatest constructions known to the world. Yet his description already reflects distance. He does not speak of the daily rituals once enacted upon its heights, nor of the ancient gods who had sanctified its stones. Instead, he offers measurements, observations of stairways, altars, and a chamber above. What had once been a temple was to him a tower, an architectural phenomenon more than a living sanctuary. Greek fascination with Mesopotamia unfolded in this way. Awe mingled with incomprehension. They looked upon forms but not functions, remnants severed from the beliefs that had once animated them. By the time of Alexander's campaigns in the 4th century BCE, many of these structures had already collapsed or been abandoned. The Greeks, heirs to their own myths of divine mountains and sacred altars, struggled to understand what they saw, yet they recorded it, giving Western memory a thread of continuity. Later, Greek and Hellenistic writers began to weave these monuments into familiar narratives. The towering structures of Babylon were remembered not merely as temples, but as symbols of hubris. Already, a new interpretation was forming. The ziggurat became fused with the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, a monument to human pride punished by divine decree. The Greeks themselves did not create this connection, but their descriptions made it possible. They preserved the image of a spiraling tower ascending toward heaven, a silhouette that would carry forward into Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. To the Greeks, the ruins of Mesopotamia were at once alien and strangely familiar. They had their own sacred mountains, Olympus, Parnassus, where gods were said to dwell. They knew of altars, sacrifices, and temples raised high above the ground. Yet the scale of Mesopotamian towers surpassed what they knew. Herodotus, and later Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and others wrote of their astonishment, yet they framed it within the language of their own world. They spoke of Babylon as vast, of its walls as impossible in dimension, of its towers as wonders. But the living theology behind them remained elusive. This gap is telling. By the time Greek eyes fell upon Mesopotamia, the ancient cults were waning. The scribes who had once inscribed hymns to Inanna and Marduk were gone. The ritual processions that had climbed the Ziggurat steps had ceased. What the Greeks saw was architecture without myth, skeletons of rituals stripped of their flesh. In trying to describe them, they reached for metaphors they could grasp: a tower, a stairway, an altar in the clouds. And yet, even in their incomprehension, they ensured survival. Without Herodotus, without the scattered remarks of later writers, the memory of Babylon's towers might have vanished entirely until rediscovered in the dust of 19th century excavations. Through the Greeks, the ziggurat became part of Europe's imagination long before archaeology gave it shape. The blending of awe and misunderstanding shaped the legacy of Mesopotamian architecture for centuries. In Greek retellings, the ziggurat was not primarily a place of divine communion, but a stage for mythic lessons. The Tower of Babel story, later preserved in biblical texts, transformed it into a cautionary monument: human arrogance against divine authority. The original function, as a cosmic axis linking earth and heaven, consecrated by ritual, was replaced by moral allegory. Yet in that transformation, something survived. The vision of humanity building upward, reaching beyond the mortal sphere. When Alexander the Great entered Babylon in 331 BCE, he too looked upon its ruins with wonder. Ancient sources suggest that he even ordered the restoration of Etemenanke, the great Ziggurat of Babylon, whose name meant House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. But the project was never completed. Within a few years, Alexander himself was dead, and the ziggurat continued to decay. His ambition, like the structure itself, remained unfinished. The Greeks could admire, even attempt to restore, but they could not re-enter the sacred world that had produced such monuments. The silence of the Greeks on the inner meaning of ziggurats leaves us with questions. Did they hear echoes of the old stories from Babylonian priests? Did they sense that these were not merely towers, but stairways of ritual ascent and descent, symbolic mountains rising from the plain? Or did they encounter only the shells of brick and the fading whispers of a civilization already forgotten? The texts do not say. They preserve images, measurements, impressions, but not the inner voice of Mesopotamia itself. Yet the very act of looking mattered. Through their eyes, the West inherited the outline of a ziggurat. Even stripped of its rituals, its form endured. A stepped tower reaching toward the sky, circling upward like a spiral into the heavens. In this silhouette, European memory preserved something essential. When later artists, theologians and poets spoke of the Tower of Babel, they unconsciously recalled the reports of Greek travelers who had seen Babylon's ruins with their own eyes. The Greek encounter with Mesopotamia reminds us of a paradox. To see a ruin is not to know it. The Greeks preserved fragments, but they also reshaped them, bending them into the framework of their own imagination. Their writings are both a window and a veil, a glimpse of ancient structures and a distortion of their meaning. We too look back through their words, seeing what they saw, monuments vast and crumbling, but also aware of what they missed. And so, across centuries, the ziggurat survives in shadow, not as it was, alive with ritual and chant, but as the Greeks beheld it, silent, enigmatic, towering against the horizon. Through their imperfect eyes, the memory passed forward, into scripture, into myth, into the long corridors of Western thought. They may not have understood, but they ensured it would not be forgotten. Today, as archaeologists sift through layers of Mesopotamian soil, piecing together bricks stamped with royal names, the Greek accounts remain as echoes, a reminder of how fragile memory can be, and how easily meaning is lost when the rituals fade. Yet within that loss lies survival. For even in misunderstanding, the Greeks preserved the outline of a sacred mountain built by human hands. And through their voices, we too are invited to stand before those towers, to look upward, to wonder, to ask not only what the Greeks saw, but what had already been lost by the time their eyes first fell upon the ruins. The encounter was never complete, never full. It was partial, fragmented, suspended between awe and absence. And it leaves us with the haunting question: how much of the ancient world is preserved not by understanding, but by misunderstanding? by the imperfect gaze of those who came after. The ziggurats linger still, half visible in that twilight, their true meaning receding even as their silhouette endures. Chapter 23. Medieval memory and the ruins of Uruk. Long after the last kings of Babylon had fallen, and long after the priests had abandoned their shrines, the Ziggurats of Mesopotamia did not simply vanish. They endured as broken silhouettes on the horizon, their once perfect terraces sloping into heaps of mud brick and dust. By the Middle Ages, when caravans traced the trade routes of Iraq and scholars set pen to parchment, these mounds remained, silent, enigmatic, half consumed by the desert. To those who passed by, they were not ruins of a known past. They were mysteries, and into that mystery, legend poured itself freely. Muslim historians, geographers, and travelers of the medieval world sought to understand these strange hulks of earth. With archaeology yet unborn, their tools were scripture, inherited lore, and the imaginations of storytellers. The Quran and the Bible loomed large in their explanations, and the crumbling towers seemed to invite such associations. They spoke of Nimrod, the tyrant king who defied heaven. They spoke of giants who once strode the earth and built monuments too vast for ordinary men. And above all, they spoke of a tower raised in rebellion, the Tower of Babel, its ruins still visible near Babylon. The site of Borsippa, only a short distance from Babylon itself, came to embody this memory. Its massive ruin, now known as the Burz Nimrud, rose above the plain like a scar from an age before history. To medieval travelers, its sloping form and fused bricks bore witness to fire and divine wrath. Local traditions claimed it as the Tower of Babel, the very place where humanity's single tongue had been shattered into many. The structure, in their telling, was not merely a ruin, but a monument of punishment, a reminder of humanity's audacity and its humbling. Writers such as al-Mas'udi, the 10th century historian often called the Herodotus of the Arabs, recorded traditions that tied these ruins to biblical and Quranic figures. To him, they were remnants of a primordial age, towers built before the flood or by the hands of Nimrod, the archetypal tyrant. In his narratives, the landscape of Iraq was alive with echoes of divine judgment. The eroded ziggurats were not silent architecture, but testimonies, cautionary tales etched into the desert. Other geographers, like Yaqut al-Hamawi in the 13th century, described the strange mounds of Mesopotamia with awe. His encyclopedic writings preserve place names, legends, and local traditions. In his descriptions, the ruins were inseparable from story. Some were said to be the dwellings of vanished peoples, others the petrified remains of palaces. He did not seek to measure their dimensions or trace their bricks to ancient dynasties. Instead, he preserved their mythic aura, ensuring that later generations inherited not only the physical memory of these places, but also the imaginative ones. Travelers from beyond the Islamic world added their voices as well. Jewish pilgrims, Christian monks, and later European envoys all encountered these crumbling towers. Many agreed with the identification of the ruins with the Tower of Babel. Others interpreted them as the work of giants destroyed in the days of Noah. Their writings show how enduring the flood narrative remained. Even in the imagination of the medieval age, the ruins, weathered but vast, seemed to demand an origin older than ordinary history could supply. To the people of Iraq in this period, these mounds were landmarks, woven into local geography and daily life. Shepherds grazed their flocks near them. Pilgrims paused at their bases. Storytellers spun tales in their shadow. Without the modern sciences of excavation or chronology, their meaning was fluid, shaped by scripture, tradition, and the human hunger for explanation. The landscape itself became a living book, its pages written in clay and eroded by time. What is striking is how these medieval accounts ensured continuity of memory. While the knowledge of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon faded, the ruins themselves remained impossible to ignore. They were not studied, but they were never forgotten. Instead, they were absorbed into the mythic and religious frameworks of the age. The Tower of Babel, the tyrannies of Nimrod, the flood, the lives of giants, all were grafted onto the mounds of ancient ziggurats. In this way, even without archaeology, the thread of Mesopotamia was never severed. Centuries would pass before scholars like Claudius Rich, Austin Henry Layard, and Hormuzd Rassam uncovered the buried cities and translated the cuneiform tablets. But when they did, they found that medieval memory had not been entirely mistaken. The Birs Nimrud was indeed a ziggurat dedicated to the god Nabu at Borsippa. The great mounds scattered across Iraq were not random earthworks, but deliberate monuments of brick, foundations of temples that once reached toward the sky. The stories of Babel and Nimrod, though shaped by faith and imagination, had preserved at least a shadow of truth. These ruins had always been towers, monuments that bound heaven and earth, the medieval world. Therefore, stands as a bridge between antiquity and modernity. Without its storytellers, the memory of Mesopotamia might have faded entirely into sand. But because they kept alive the idea that these mounds mattered, that they were relics of giants, of Babel, of vanished empires, the ruins were never erased from cultural consciousness. They endured as landmarks of legend, half buried but never wholly lost. Even now, as archaeologists measure foundations and reconstruct timelines, those medieval stories linger in the imagination. The Birs Nimrud is still called the Tower of Babel by locals. Nimrod remains a name bound to Mesopotamian ruins, whispered in villages near ancient sites. And the image of flood, rebellion, and punishment still hovers above the ziggurats, as if myth itself had soaked into their bricks. To walk among the ruins today is to sense both histories at once, the measured voice of archaeology and the timeless murmur of legend. Medieval memory, shaped by faith and imagination, gave the ruins a second life when their first was already buried. Without it, we might never have looked again to Iraq's mounds with curiosity or reverence. And so the ziggurats, though eroded, did not vanish into silence. They lived on as stories, as warnings, as wonders. In their broken form, they inspired awe, and through that awe, they survived. The medieval traveller who paused at their shadow carried forward a memory we still inherit, that these ruins, whatever their origin, spoke of something immense, something lost, and something worth remembering. Chapter 24. European Rediscovery and the Birth of Archaeology. By the early 19th century, the deserts of Mesopotamia were dotted with vast, silent mounds. To the casual traveller, they looked like natural hills, shapeless rises of clay covered with scrub and scattered stones. But to local villagers, they were known as tells, places where broken bricks, pottery shards, and fragments of carved stone surfaced after rains. Beneath those mounds lay the buried cities of antiquity, the ruins of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. To Europeans of the time, these lands were not merely distant provinces of the Ottoman Empire. They were the setting of scripture, the cradle of civilization, and the landscape of myth. It was here that the Garden of Eden was said to have flourished, here that the Tower of Babel rose toward the heavens, here that mighty kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib once ruled. The soil of Mesopotamia was believed to conceal not only the remnants of ancient peoples, but also the keys to understanding the Bible itself. It was this blend of biblical curiosity, imperial rivalry, and scholarly ambition that drove the first wave of European explorers to dig into the mounds. They came with little in the way of modern archaeological technique. Many were diplomats, adventurers, or soldiers, whose excavations resembled treasure hunts more than careful study. But their efforts marked the beginning of a new discipline, archaeology, and forever changed how the world viewed Mesopotamia's lost monuments. The first digs, curiosity and competition among. The earliest figures was Claudius James Rich, a British East India Company officer stationed in Baghdad in the early 1800s. Rich collected artifacts and made sketches of ruins, documenting the ancient city of Babylon with a precision rare for his time. Though he did not conduct large-scale excavations, his maps and descriptions sparked European fascination and laid the groundwork for those who followed. His reports convinced many that the fabled sites of scripture were not imaginary, but real and waiting to be uncovered. The next generation of explorers turned curiosity into action. Austin Henry Layard, an Englishman with a taste for adventure, arrived in the 1840s. With little more than picks, shovels, and hired local laborers, he began excavating the mounds of northern Mesopotamia. What he uncovered stunned the world. Colossal winged bulls, endless carved reliefs, and the remains of Assyrian palaces at Nineveh and Nimrud. Layard's finds were shipped to London, where they filled the newly established Assyrian galleries of the British Museum. For the Victorian public, these discoveries were electrifying, a confirmation that the half-forgotten empires of the Old Testament had truly existed. Working alongside Layard was Hormuzd Rassam, a native Assyrian from Mosul who became one of the most skilled excavators of his era. Though often overshadowed by his European counterparts, Rassam played a crucial role in recovering cuneiform tablets, statues, and monumental architecture. His efforts helped introduce Mesopotamia to the world stage of history and archaeology, bridging local knowledge with foreign scholarship. The ziggurats emerge, while Layard's finds brought Assyrian palaces into the light. It was later excavators who turned their attention to the mysterious stepped mounds that hinted at something different: ziggurats. At Babylon, the German architect Robert Koldewey undertook one of the most meticulous excavations of the 19th century. Beginning in 1899, he and his team spent nearly 2 decades systematically uncovering the city. Unlike earlier explorers, Koldewey applied architectural training to the ruins, carefully documenting walls, foundations, and stratigraphy. His most famous discovery was the reconstruction of Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon. To Koldewey, this was not only an archaeological triumph, but also a biblical vindication. Here, he believed, stood the historical reality behind the Tower of Babel. His publications and reconstructions fired the imagination of both scholars and the public, fusing archaeology with legend in a way that still lingers today. Farther south, at the site of Ur, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley embarked on a series of excavations beginning in the 1920s. While Woolley is best remembered for uncovering the royal cemetery, his work at the city's ziggurat was equally transformative. As teams cleared centuries of sand and debris, the stage platforms of Ur's Great Tower emerged, brick upon brick, stair upon stair. For the first time in millennia, the form of a ziggurat could be seen clearly. Woolley's discoveries confirmed that these structures were not myth, but tangible realities, monuments of staggering ambition, rooted in both religion and royal propaganda, from myth to history. These excavations did more than satisfy curiosity. They transformed ziggurats from legendary towers into historical artifacts. The biblical story of Babel, long interpreted by many Europeans as allegory, suddenly seemed tethered to brick foundations rising from the Mesopotamian plain. The strange high places described in ancient texts were no longer abstractions but architectural realities. Photographs, sketches, and even reconstructions brought their image to audiences across Europe and America, feeding museums, newspapers, and lecture halls. And yet, archaeology did not merely confirm old beliefs, it complicated them. Inscriptions found at Babylon and Ur repeatedly spoke of kings, restoring the ancient foundations. Such language raised unsettling questions. Were even the mighty kings of Mesopotamia working upon ruins left by predecessors? Were the ziggurats themselves already ancient when Nebuchadnezzar or Nabopolassar laid their bricks? Each discovery deepened the mystery of origins, suggesting a timeline of building, rebuilding, and restoration that stretched far longer than most had imagined. Imperial shadows. The rediscovery of ziggurats was not free from the politics of empire. Excavations were often carried out under the authority of European powers, with artifacts shipped abroad to London, Paris, or Berlin. Local voices were marginalized, and the ruins of Mesopotamia became trophies in the competition of nations. The British Museum, the Louvre, and the Pergamon Museum filled their halls with colossal statues, carved panels, and fragments of ziggurats, turning Mesopotamian heritage into global spectacle. For European audiences, this was an age of wonder. For the people of Iraq and surrounding regions, it was often an age of dispossession. The birth of archaeology coincided with colonial ambition, and the legacy of this entanglement still shapes debates over ownership and cultural heritage today. The birth of a discipline. Despite its flaws, the 19th century marked the true birth of archaeology as a science. Early treasure hunting gradually gave way to more careful excavation, documentation, and preservation. Scholars began to piece together the cuneiform script, translating royal inscriptions that boasted of building and rebuilding ziggurats. Historians compared texts with excavated ruins, aligning myth, memory, and material evidence. A new picture emerged. Ziggurats were not singular creations, but layered monuments rebuilt across centuries, carrying the voices of successive kings. By the dawn of the 20th century, the ziggurat was no longer a phantom of legend. It was a historical reality, standing at the intersection of religion, politics, and human ambition. The rediscovery of these monuments had redefined both archaeology and the Western imagination, legacy of rediscovery today, the legacy of those 19th century excavations endures. Many of the great museums still house the artifacts carried away during that era. The outlines of Babylon, Nineveh, and Ur are known to the world because of the efforts, both clumsy and brilliant, of those early explorers. Their work transformed Mesopotamia from a land of myth into a field of science, even as they carried with them the shadows of empire. Most of all, their rediscovery reawakened the ziggurat. For millennia, these towers had lain buried, their bricks melting back into the earth. To later generations, they were remembered only in scripture, legend, and rumor. But with the picks and shovels of the 19th century, they rose again into human memory. No longer silent mounds, they became monuments once more, bridges between past and present, myth and history. The birth of archaeology, then, was not just the uncovering of stone and clay, it was the uncovering of humanity's own forgotten story. The revelation that beneath the sands of Mesopotamia lay the foundations of civilization itself. And in those foundations, stage upon stage, the ziggurats stood waiting, half ruin, half resurrection, testaments to an ancient ambition to climb toward the heavens. Chapter 25. The science of mud brick in the blazing heat of southern Mesopotamia, where rivers bend and deserts stretch endlessly. The greatest monuments of one of humanity's earliest civilizations were not built from marble or granite, but from earth itself. Sun-dried clay, pressed into humble rectangular forms, became the foundation of cities, temples, and ziggurats. These were bricks born not of permanence, but of necessity. Fragile, perishable, dissolving back into soil with the passage of time. And yet, for more than 3,000 years, they sustained the architecture of an entire world. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt, whose stone faces still catch the desert light, the towers of Mesopotamia exist now only as eroded mounds, their outlines blur into the horizon, their summits lost, their grandeur reduced to heaps of broken clay. For archaeologists, this fragility is both a curse and a key. What the wind and rain consume, they also reveal. Each crumbling brick carries within it the fingerprints of ancient hands, the chemistry of ancient soils, and the stories of the kings who raised them. The science of mud brick begins in the earth. Mesopotamia's alluvial plain, formed by the Tigris and Euphrates, offered abundant clay but little stone. To survive, builders shaped their environment. They mixed river silt with chaff, straw, or crushed reeds to bind the material. Water was added, and the mixture was pressed into molds, then left to dry beneath the relentless sun. The result was simple yet versatile. A brick that could be stacked into walls, coated with bitumen, and renewed when weather or time brought decay. But these bricks were never eternal. Sun-dried clay softens in rain, crumbles with flood, and turns to dust when left exposed. To protect their monuments, Mesopotamian builders often faced the lower levels of ziggurats with fired brick, baked hard in kilns and sealed with bitumen. These durable layers acted as armor for the softer cores within. Yet no defense was perfect. Over centuries, erosion gnawed at the edges, and great towers melted into shapeless hills. Still, in their ruin, they speak. Archaeologists working at sites like Ur, Uruk, and Nippur find more than disintegration. They uncover evidence of technique, of repair, of intention. Chemical analysis of surviving bricks reveals their origins. Clay drawn from local pits, sometimes mixed with river sediment, carried from miles away. Differences in composition mark phases of construction. One layer from one king, another from his successor. In this way, the ziggurat becomes a palimpsest, each generation leaving its mark in clay. Some bricks tell their stories more directly. Pressed into their surfaces are stamped inscriptions, names of kings, dedications to gods, declarations of restoration. At Ur, bricks bear the mark of Ur-Nammu, the Sumerian ruler who first raised the city's ziggurat around 2100 BCE. Others carry the name of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who restored the same structure 2,500 years later. Each inscription is both propaganda and preservation, a statement that the temple was renewed, not abandoned. Other clues come in the scars of catastrophe. Bricks blackened by fire suggest siege or ritual burning. Layers warped by water recall ancient floods. At some sites, collapsed mud brick walls reveal hasty reconstruction, as if kings raced to rebuild sacred towers against the pressure of decay. Archaeologists must read these subtle signs, piecing together the life histories of structures that no longer stand. Why? Then, did the people of Mesopotamia, so ambitious in vision, so skilled in craft, rely on such fragile material? The simplest answer lies in geography. Unlike Egypt, with its quarries of limestone and granite, southern Mesopotamia offered little durable stone. Clay was abundant, endlessly available, and perfectly suited to the flat plains where cities rose. Mud brick was the material of necessity, but necessity is not the only explanation. Some scholars suggest that impermanence itself was part of the design. Mud brick structures required constant renewal. Walls crumbled, towers sagged, temples demanded repair. Each king, each generation was called to rebuild, to restore, to lay foundations anew. In this cycle of construction and decay, memory was reinforced. To repair the ziggurat was not merely maintenance, it was ritual. It was an act of piety, a visible demonstration that the bond between the city and its gods remained unbroken. In this sense, fragility became strength. A stone monument endures untouched, its builders long forgotten. A mud brick monument demands attention, weaving its restoration into the rhythm of history. The Ziggurat of Ur, rebuilt across centuries by rulers from Sumerian to Babylonian times, was not a single structure but a succession of structures, each layer a new covenant, each brick a renewed vow. Archaeologists, working with the tools of science, uncover these rhythms in ways the ancients could not have imagined. Microscopic analysis shows how straw fibers strengthened bricks, preventing cracks as they dried. X-ray fluorescence reveals the mineral fingerprints of clay beds, linking bricks to specific regions. Even the impressions left by reeds or wooden molds can tell us about the tools and labor of those who made them. In this way, the smallest fragments open windows into entire economies of labor, trade, and devotion. Yet, despite the precision of modern science, much remains hidden. Many ziggurats are so eroded that their original outlines cannot be traced. Some appear only as vast, featureless mounds. Excavation often destroys what little remains, leaving archaeologists with the difficult choice between preservation and discovery. What we can never fully recover is the experience. The sight of these towers rising from the flat horizon, gleaming with fired brick, their summits crowned with temples, their stairways echoing with the footsteps of priests. In the end, the science of mud brick is not only about materials and methods, it is about impermanence, about the fragile medium through which one of the world's first civilizations chose to shape its sacred architecture. The ziggurats that once dominated Mesopotamia's skylines have crumbled, but in their very ruin, they embody the paradox of human striving, to reach for the eternal with tools that are temporary, to shape the cosmos from earth that returns to dust. And so, when we stand before the low mounds that were once towers, when we hold in hand a crumbling brick stamped with the name of a forgotten king, we glimpse both the fragility and the persistence of human memory. For though the bricks dissolve, the idea they carried, the act of building, of raising the sacred from the soil, endures. It is a reminder that permanence is not always found in stone. Sometimes it lies in the cycle of renewal, in the stories inscribed upon clay, in the invisible bond between builders, gods, and the earth itself. And perhaps this is the true legacy of mud brick, that from the most fragile of materials, humanity shaped monuments whose echoes still rise, even when the towers themselves have fallen. Chapter 26. Astronomical alignments and ritual calendars. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, silent now in their decay, once stood not only as towers of brick, but as instruments of orientation. When archaeologists measured their foundations and traced the long-buried courses of their walls, a pattern began to emerge. Many of these structures were not set haphazardly upon the plain. They were aligned, precisely, deliberately, with the four cardinal directions, or with the rising of stars, or with the turning points of the sun's path across the sky. This is no small detail. To orient stone, to anchor brick upon the earth, is to declare relationship with the heavens. In the Mesopotamian worldview, time itself was not linear, but cyclical, bound to the movements of planets and constellations. To build with orientation was to bind a temple into that eternal rhythm. The ziggurat became not only a dwelling for gods, but also a calendar in brick, a silent mechanism by which the movements of the cosmos were mirrored on Earth. The evidence is tantalizing. The great Ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, has long been thought to embody lunar symbolism. Nana, whose light waxes and wanes in a measured cycle, was a deity of time. his phases marking the calendar of festivals and offerings. To ascend the Ziggurat's steps may have been to enact that same cycle, the climb of brightness, the descent into shadow, each step a mirror of celestial rhythm. When the moon rose over Ur, its silver arc above the terraces would have seemed more than coincidence. It was alignment, ritualized in architecture. Elsewhere, scholars have suggested solar connections. Some ziggurats face east, greeting the sun at equinox or solstice. At Babylon, priests stationed upon temple platforms were said to record eclipses, transits, and planetary conjunctions. Their work was meticulous. For centuries, Babylonian astronomers kept clay tablets filled with lists of lunar eclipses and the movements of Venus. To them, the heavens were a text, a script written by the gods, and it was their duty to read it. The ziggurat's height, its sweeping view across the plain, made it an ideal platform for such watching. Observatory and sanctuary were not separate. To watch the sky was itself an act of devotion. Skeptics caution restraint. They warn that alignments can be found where none were intended, that many ancient builders favored cardinal directions simply as a matter of order and symmetry. And yet, the persistence across centuries and across cities is difficult to ignore. Why, if not for purpose, would so many towers face east, or frame the rising of a celestial body? Even if chance plays its part, the symbolic resonance cannot be denied. A temple turned toward the horizon at solstice is not merely a structure, it becomes a stage for ritual, a place where human ceremony is timed with cosmic event. The Babylonian Enuma Anu Enlil tablets, a vast compendium of omens, reveal how deeply entwined the heavens were with earthly fate. Eclipses foretold the downfall of kings. The rising of Venus signaled victory or defeat. Each planet was the embodiment of a deity, Jupiter as Marduk, Venus as Ishtar, Saturn as Ninurta. To chart their courses was to glimpse the unfolding will of the gods. From the high terraces of ziggurats, priests lifted their eyes, watching for signs. Each observation was not only astronomy, but theology, ritualized science in service of divination. Consider too the symbolism of height. A ziggurat was not merely a tower for observation, it was a mountain built upon a plain. In Mesopotamian thought, mountains were liminal, the places where heaven touched earth. To ascend a ziggurat was to cross that threshold. The alignment of its stairways with the stars may have been an extension of that symbolism. One climbed not only to offer sacrifice, but to join the rhythm of the heavens. The architecture itself became a cosmic diagram, an axis around which both ritual and time revolved. Archaeological traces support this vision. At Ur, beneath the foundations, tablets were buried naming the moon god Nana, dedicating the structure to his cycles. At Sippar, where the sun god Shamash was worshipped, orientation towards sunrise seems deliberate, binding temple to solar course. At Borsippa, the ziggurat dedicated to Nabu, the god of wisdom and scribes, stood as a reminder that observation and knowledge were sacred acts. Each city, each god, was tied not only to the earth beneath, but to the sky above. And yet, what survives is fragmentary. Many ziggurats are ruined, their upper terraces collapsed, their sightlines lost. What rituals once unfolded upon their heights can only be guessed. Did priests chant hymns as the first light of dawn spilled across the horizon? Did they mark calendars by watching Venus appear before the sun? Or did the people, gathered below, lift their eyes to see the tower itself glowing in alignment with moon or sun, understanding that their city was bound to the order of the cosmos? The silence of archaeology offers no certainty, only shadows of possibility. Still, the persistence of astronomical thought in Mesopotamia cannot be ignored. By the late 1st millennium BCE, Babylonian astronomy had grown astonishingly precise. Clay tablets record complex calculations predicting eclipses and planetary motions with accuracy that astonished later Greek scholars. The roots of that science lay not in detached observation, but in sacred practice. Watching the sky from temple heights was never a secular pursuit. It was part of ritual, part of a worldview in which heaven and earth mirrored one another. The ziggurat was the hinge of that mirror, binding human ceremony to cosmic event. The dual function, temple and observatory, sanctuary and calendar, remains one of the most striking aspects of Mesopotamian architecture. The ziggurat was a dwelling place of gods, but it was also a stage where cosmic time unfolded. Each festival, each procession, was timed not merely to human choice, but to celestial alignment. When the moon was dark, sacrifices to Nana were made. When Venus rose in the dawn, hymns to Inanna filled the air. Architecture, ritual, and astronomy formed a seamless whole, and so we return to the question of intention. Were the alignments precise acts of design, or did meaning accrue afterward? Rituals adapted to the shape of the structure. Perhaps both are true. Human builders laid bricks by hand, guided by priests who read the sky. Over time, as generations passed, meaning deepened, the tower became not only a house of a god, but a living calendar. Its stairways, its shadows, its orientations became part of the rhythm of life, marking festivals, planting, harvest, and the turning of years. Today, standing before their ruins, we are left with fragments of this cosmic architecture. The towers are broken, their summits eroded, their alignments obscured by time. Yet even in ruin they speak. Their orientation remains measurable. Their foundations, set toward the cardinal points, whisper of intention. Their very form reminds us that for the Mesopotamians, the line between earth and sky was never absolute. To build was to mirror the heavens. To lay a brick was to join in a cosmic order. The ziggurats, then, were more than monuments. They were instruments of time, binding ritual and astronomy into one. Each ascent was a reenactment of the heavens. Each alignment, a joining of human and divine calendars. Whether through intention or coincidence, the persistence of these orientations reveals a worldview in which architecture and cosmos were inseparable. We cannot know for certain what the priests saw from their heights, nor the full meanings they gave to their alignments, but we can sense in the silence of their ruins that the stars were never far from their thoughts. Each brick, each step was laid not only for the gods, but for the heavens. And as night falls over the Mesopotamian plain, the stars still rise over the broken towers as they did millennia ago. Their alignments endure, silent reminders of a time when architecture itself was a calendar, and when the boundary between heaven and earth was walked with every step upon a ziggurat stair. Chapter 27. Forbidden Knowledge and Suppressed Theories. There are places in history where silence feels heavier than words. The Ziggurats of Mesopotamia belong to that silence. Their bricks speak of labor, of ritual, of devotion, but they also whisper of secrets, of things concealed, of knowledge that may have been deliberately withheld. In the shadows of these artificial mountains, modern imagination finds fertile ground, and questions that conventional archaeology often leaves unanswered continue to echo. The ancient texts themselves provide the seed. In cuneiform inscriptions, priests described their sanctuaries as keepers of the secrets of the gods. The ziggurat was not only a stairway between heaven and earth, but a house of mysteries, its summit shrine closed to all but the initiated. Ordinary citizens could look upward, but they could not climb into the presence of the divine. Whatever transpired at those altars, whatever words were spoken and symbols preserved, remained hidden. In this exclusivity, some see not only theology, but control, a sacred monopoly on knowledge, veiled beneath the sanctity of ritual. For those who look to the gaps of history, this secrecy has become a beacon. Were the ziggurats simply temples of brick and bitumen, or were they also repositories of coded wisdom? Were they aligned to the stars in ways not yet fully measured? Did their terraces preserve not only the rhythms of worship, but the cycles of the cosmos? These questions have animated scholars and seekers for centuries, from early biblical commentators to modern theorists who sense a missing story beneath the surface of archaeology. In the 20th century, as excavation brought the first foundations of Babylon and Ur into modern sight, alternative theories emerged in parallel. Writers drew comparisons between ziggurats and pyramids, seeing in both the universal form of the sacred mountain. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, across continents, civilizations raised tiered monuments, often aligned with celestial bodies. Was this coincidence, or the fingerprint of a deeper connection? Mainstream archaeology emphasizes independent development shaped by local conditions. Yet for others, the similarities suggest the persistence of an ancient global tradition, one perhaps older than the civilizations themselves. Linked to this is the haunting motif of a flood. From the Atrahasis to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Mesopotamian literature describes waters that erased nearly all life. Some theorists ask whether the ziggurats, towering above the floodplain, were not only symbols of mountains, but memories of survival, architectural echoes of a time when elevation meant life. If so, then their function was not only ritual, but preservational. In this light, whispers arise of pre-flood knowledge encoded in their design, survival strategies cast into brick, waiting for rediscovery. The allure of forbidden knowledge is deepened by the absences in the archaeological record. Akkad, the capital of the world's first empire, has never been found. Thousands of tablets remain untranslated, locked away in museum archives. Entire ziggurats crumble beneath layers of soil, inaccessible to study. These gaps breed speculation. Were some texts deliberately suppressed by later empires, erasing dangerous knowledge? Did conquerors bury monuments not only to assert power, but to obscure memory? The absence itself becomes a form of presence, inviting imagination to fill the void. Modern fringe theories build upon this mystery, sometimes weaving threads that archaeology cannot support, yet which resonate with the longing for deeper meaning. Some propose that ziggurats encoded astronomical knowledge, predicting solstices, eclipses, or the precession of the equinoxes. Others claim they formed part of an energy system, harnessing telluric currents through their layered design. More radical voices see in them evidence of contact with lost civilizations, Atlantis, or cultures that preceded the flood. Though mainstream historians rightly warn against such leaps, the endurance of these theories speaks to a truth of another kind. The ruins themselves resist final explanation. Even within the ancient record, hints remain tantalizing. Babylonian texts speak of tablets of destiny, divine records that governed the fates of men and gods alike. Were such tablets merely myth, or reflections of archives once kept within temple walls? Archaeological evidence shows that ziggurats were often surrounded by libraries, collections of clay tablets inscribed with hymns, omens, and astronomical observations. The Great Library of Ashurbanipal, discovered at Nineveh, confirms the Mesopotamian devotion to preserving knowledge. If such archives existed besides ziggurats, could some still lie undiscovered beneath the dust? To suggest suppression is not always to imagine conspiracy. Sometimes it is the quiet suppression of time itself. Rivers shifting course, fires consuming archives, looters scattering fragments. Yet across centuries, a deeper suspicion persists that there are truths about human origins, about cycles of destruction and renewal, that were known to the ancients and veiled from the masses. In this perspective, the ziggurats become not only shrines, but veiled testimonies, encoded in architecture for those with eyes to see. In the modern age, as satellites map the plains of Iraq and Iran, new anomalies appear, buried foundations, faint traces of lost walls, patterns invisible from the ground. Some researchers suggest that we may yet find undiscovered ziggurats, their knowledge preserved in silence. But even if uncovered, would we be able to read them fully? Or would their true significance remain as elusive as ever? Half seen, half felt, forever withheld. The persistence of forbidden theories, then, may not rest on their factual certainty, but on their psychological power. They remind us that the story of Mesopotamia is not complete, that archaeology's neat timelines do not exhaust the possibilities. They echo a deeper truth, that humanity has always sensed in its monuments more than stone and brick. We sense intention, design, purpose that transcends mere construction. We sense a message, blurred by time but not erased. Perhaps, in the end, this is the greatest gift of the ziggurats. They do not surrender their meaning easily. They resist reduction, leaving space for wonder, for speculation, for reverence. Whether or not they conceal suppressed wisdom, they continue to act as teachers, reminding us that knowledge is never complete, that history is always partly hidden, and that mystery itself has power. And so the ziggurats endure, not only as ruins of clay, but as riddles of memory. Their terraces rise into the imagination as much as into the sky, each level carrying us closer to the question that will not fade. Were they simply temples of devotion, or vaults of forgotten truths? Their silence does not answer. It invites us only deeper into its shadow, where the boundary between history and myth grows thin, and where the ancient desire to reach upward remains as unresolved as ever. Chapter 28. The ziggurat in modern memory. In the shifting landscapes of Uruk, where deserts meet rivers and ancient ruins rise amid the hum of modern life, the ziggurat endures. It does not endure in the way its builders intended, as a mountain of unfaltering brick stretching skyward for millennia. Time has seen to that. Most of their tiers have eroded, their facings stripped, their sanctuaries long vanished. Yet their silhouette, tiered, angular, ascending, remains a form etched into the memory of humanity. In the modern world, the ziggurat is no longer merely a ruin of clay. It is a symbol refracted through culture, politics, religion, and imagination. In Iraq itself, the ziggurat has become a source of pride, a monument not only to the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians, but to the enduring legacy of Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization. The great Ziggurat of Ur, partially restored in the 20th century, has become a touchstone of identity. Its immense stairway, rebuilt in the 1980s under Saddam Hussein, stands as both a reconstruction and a reminder of continuity. To many Iraqis, the bricks of Ur do not merely speak of distant kings or forgotten gods. They whisper of origins, of belonging, of a cultural inheritance that connects the present to the earliest beginnings of cities, writing, and law. Schoolchildren are taught its story. Tourists, when permitted, walk its stairs. Scholars measure its angles with modern instruments. Each group sees in it something different, but all feel its weight. Beyond Iraq, the ziggurat has taken on other lives. In Europe and America, it is often framed through the lens of biblical tradition. The Tower of Babel reborn in clay and brick. Museums display its models beside tablets inscribed with cuneiform. Textbooks place it alongside pyramids and temples, presenting it as one of humanity's great archetypes of sacred architecture. In digital reconstructions, ziggurats rise once more to their imagined heights, rendered in glowing lines and simulated sunlight. In these images, their ruined state is forgotten. What is remembered is their form, their aspiration, their symbolic climb from earth toward heaven. Yet the meaning of the ziggurat in modern memory is not fixed. It shifts as societies change. In the ancient world, it was a stage for divine kingship, a dwelling for gods, a bridge between the mortal and celestial realms. In the biblical imagination, it became a warning, a tale of human pride and divine judgment. In the colonial era, it was a prize, dug from the earth and shipped to European museums as evidence of Western scholarship and power. In the present, it oscillates between archaeological heritage, national identity, and global fascination. Each layer of meaning overlays the next, just as ancient kings once built upon the foundations of their predecessors. The survival of ziggurats into modernity has not been guaranteed. Wars have swept across their plains, leaving scars upon the sites themselves. In the last decades, the Ziggurat of Ur stood within the shadow of military bases, its ancient bricks shaken by the sounds of modern conflict. Neglect too has been a threat. Mud brick, however monumental, is vulnerable to rain, to wind, to the slow erosion of centuries. Some towers that once rose above their cities now exist only as leveled mounds, scarcely distinguishable from the desert around them, and yet, in memory, they remain unshaken. It is this endurance of form, rather than of matter, that defines the ziggurat in the modern imagination. Even when the physical monument is broken, the image survives. Architects borrow its profile in skyscrapers and memorials, layering modern steel into ancient form. Artists invoke it as a symbol of ascent, of aspiration, of the human drive to reach higher than circumstance allows. Writers and filmmakers cast it as a stage for myth or allegory, often without naming it, yet always echoing its unmistakable silhouette. There is also a quiet irony in its survival. The ziggurat was once the stage for rituals that sought to bind heaven and earth. Today, in fragments and reconstructions, it binds past and present instead. Iraqis visit Ur and see a reflection of cultural pride. Scholars sift through its bricks and see data points in the history of architecture and religion. Travelers see a monument to human ambition, and somewhere in the collective imagination, millions who have never touched its dust or walked its stairs still carry its image. A stepped mountain, rising from the plain, forever on the verge of touching the sky. Every generation rediscovers the ziggurat anew. In the 19th century, explorers revealed it to the Western world as something more than myth. In the 20th, archaeologists restored and reconstructed its ruins. In the 21st, digital tools resurrect it once more in glowing renderings, while local communities strive to protect the fragile remains. Each rediscovery adds a new layer to its meaning, just as each ancient king once added new tiers to its structure. And so, the ziggurat's endurance is not merely in brick or stone, but in memory itself. It towers still, not only above the deserts of Mesopotamia, but above our collective imagination. In its shadow, the distance between the living present and the ancient past grows thin. And though its sanctuaries lie empty, the shape remains, waiting, haunting, reminding. For the ziggurat is not gone. It persists as a symbol, a question, a silhouette against the horizon of time. Its bricks crumble, yet its meaning ascends. And as long as human beings look backward to their origins, or upward toward what lies beyond, the ziggurat will rise again, in mind, if not in matter. Chapter 29. Who built the ziggurats? In the windswept silence of the Mesopotamian plain, where dust buries the bones of cities, and the rivers shift their courses like restless serpents, one question endures. Who truly built the ziggurats? Across the centuries, kings inscribed their names into clay bricks, declaring themselves the architects of sacred towers. Ur-Nammu of Ur, Nabopolassar of Babylon, Shulgi the Great, all claimed the mantle of builder, yet, in their very inscriptions a pattern emerges. Again and again, these rulers speak not of creation, but of restoration. They boast of rebuilding on ancient foundations, of raising anew what had long been in ruin. The implication is subtle but profound, that even in the age of kings, the ziggurats already felt ancient. Archaeology has sought to untangle this lineage. Excavations at Ur reveal that beneath the grand structure restored by Nabonidus in the 6th century BCE lie earlier layers descending back to the 3rd millennium. The same pattern emerges at other sites. New brick encasing old, restoration upon restoration, until the origins blur. What was the first ziggurat? Was there a singular moment of invention, or a slow evolution of temples raised higher with each generation, until the stepped form emerged almost inevitably? The mainstream view holds to Sumerian ingenuity. In the flat, featureless plains of southern Mesopotamia, where mountains were absent, the ziggurat became a man-made high place, a stairway for the gods to descend and for humans to ascend. Temples that once stood at ground level were gradually elevated, layer upon layer, until they rose as artificial mountains. Their form was not copied from elsewhere, but born of the land itself, of clay and belief working together. Yet gaps remain in the story. The Akkadian Empire, which once stretched from the Gulf to the Levant, left behind myths, inscriptions, and scattered ruins, but its capital, Akkad, is lost. No ziggurat has been unearthed there, though texts suggest its presence. The city of Eridu, sacred to Enki, preserves foundations that stretch deep into prehistory, with temples rebuilt upon the same mound for millennia. Were these early platforms raised again and again the true ancestors of the ziggurats? Or did the idea come suddenly, as a vision, a divine command to elevate the temple into the heavens? Some scholars argue for slow evolution, pointing to the sequence of temples at Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur. Others suggest a moment of inspiration, perhaps linked to mythic memory. The Enuma Elish, with its vision of Marduk erecting a cosmic dwelling, may reflect not just theology, but architectural reality. Temples as models of the cosmos, their foundations mirroring creation itself. The ziggurats, however, feel older than their bricks allow. Their symbolism reaches deeper than their eroded walls suggest. Why did this form, unlike any other, become the dominant expression of sacred architecture in Mesopotamia? Why not domes or vast colonnades or subterranean shrines? Why always the tower, the raised, stepped mountain upon the plain? Here the answers slip from archaeology into myth. The Sumerians spoke of the Duku, the primordial mound, the first hill to rise from the waters of creation. In Egypt, the pyramids embodied a similar idea, the Ben stone, the first land upon the flood. Across cultures, the act of raising a high place carried sacred power. Perhaps the ziggurat was not an invention at all, but a memory, a reenactment of the world's first emergence, carried in myth and renewed in brick. The builders themselves were not only kings and laborers. To fashion a ziggurat required the mobilization of entire cities. Brickmakers mixing clay, women gathering reeds, priests overseeing rituals, officials managing rations, children carrying water to the drying yards. Thousands of lives converged in the slow rhythm of construction. Each worker, nameless in history, carried the weight of a stone that was not stone, of a tower that was not merely tower. In this sense, the ziggurats were collective monuments, born from the imagination and labor of a whole people, not the command of a single sovereign. And yet the kings insisted upon their authorship. To inscribe a name upon a brick was to anchor one's reign in eternity. To restore an ancient foundation was to claim continuity with the deep past. To be not only ruler of men, but custodian of the divine order. The ziggurat thus became both temple and text. A a story told in brick, in which the gods and the kings were co-authors. But behind the names, behind the rhetoric of restoration, lies the silence of an older past. Who raised the very first platforms, now buried beneath layers of later devotion? Were they Sumerians or peoples earlier still? Archaeology has no certain answer. The farther one digs, the more the evidence collapses into mud brick dust, indistinguishable from earth. The deeper the search, the older the questions. Perhaps then, the true builders were not individuals at all, but something larger. Myth itself, pressing upon human imagination. The need to elevate, to reach upward, to bring the sacred nearer, to defy the flat horizon of the Mesopotamian plain, and to set upon it a mountain of human making. This impulse is not bound to one culture or one moment. It belongs to humanity's oldest dreams. The ziggurat, in this sense, was not simply built. It was dreamed again and again through centuries of restoration. It was remembered, invoked, and reimagined. Each generation touched its bricks, carried its clay, and in doing so reenacted the act of creation. The ziggurat is less a monument than a mirror, reflecting the timeless human desire to reach upward, to pierce the boundary between earth and sky. And so the question, who built the ziggurats, remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. They were built by kings, yes, but also by workers, by Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, by generations of hands now forgotten, by myths older than any one people, by ambition, by necessity, by faith. They were built not once, but many times, each tower both old and new, both ruin and renewal. Today, their ruins linger as shapeless mounds. Their stairways are gone, their summits crumbled. Yet the question endures, rising above the dust like the towers once did. Who built them? The answer lies somewhere between archaeology and imagination, between history and myth. And in that space, unresolved, unfinished, we find not just the story of Mesopotamia, but a reflection of ourselves, builders forever reaching upward, beyond the horizon of the known. Chapter 30. The Eternal Mystery of Mesopotamia. The ruins of Mesopotamia's ziggurats rise from the plain like broken teeth, their once proud forms reduced by centuries of wind and time. Their bricks are cracked, their terraces collapsed, their stairways long since buried beneath drifting sand, and yet, even in ruin, they command silence. There is something in their outline, those deliberate angles, those remnants of ascent, that continues to draw the eye upward into mystery. For more than a century, archaeologists have sifted through their remains. They have catalogued stamped bricks naming kings, measured foundations with precision, traced the outlines of shrines long gone. They can tell us who built, who restored, who claimed divine sanction for their labor. They can date the clay, identify the timber, reconstruct the terraces, and yet, for all the details, the essence remains elusive. What in truth were these towers? The simplest answer has never satisfied. They were temples, yes, raised to gods who watched over the cities below. They were symbols of power, yes, monuments to kings who inscribed their names on every brick. They were astronomical markers, perhaps, aligned to stars, to solstices, to the cyclical dance of sun and moon. But beyond these layers lies something deeper, something that resists certainty. The ziggurat is at once a house and a mountain, both earthbound and heavenly. In its terraces, we glimpse the shape of myth, the axis where divine and mortal realms converge. Each ascent was more than physical. It was symbolic, an enactment of humanity's endless striving to reach beyond itself. The ziggurat is the material, form of yearning, its bricks the embodiment of a question older than history, how to touch the infinite. Generations reinterpreted these towers, just as generations rebuilt them. To the Sumerians, they may have been cosmic mountains. To the Akkadians, they became proof of empire, foundations of heaven and earth. To the Babylonians, they were instruments of ritual, tied to calendars and gods of wisdom. To later Greek travelers, they were monuments stripped of meaning, towers of brick mistaken for towers of Babel. Each layer of interpretation added another mask, another echo, while the core slipped further from reach. It is perhaps this very mutability that ensures their survival in memory. Ziggurats were never static symbols. They lived, they changed, they absorbed new meanings as cultures rose and fell. Their mystery is not the absence of interpretation, but the abundance of it. Every generation saw in them what it most desired, or most feared: power, order, ambition, divine presence. They endure not as answers, but as questions cast in brick. As night falls over their ruins, the atmosphere shifts. The harsh glare of the sun softens, and shadows blur their lines into something less architectural, more dreamlike. The desert air cools, and silence deepens. It is then, under the rising of the stars, that their presence feels most complete. The ziggurats stand not only as remnants of architecture, but as thresholds into myth. Their outlines blend with constellations above, and one begins to see why. Ancient people believed these towers were not of Earth alone. Archaeology, with all its precision, cannot close this gap. It can measure, translate, reconstruct. But the ziggurat's essence belongs as much to imagination as to science. We may never know the hymns once sung on their terraces, the exact rites performed at their shrines, the precise meaning of their alignments. But perhaps that absence is itself the gift. They remind us that history is not only a record of what is known, but also a vast silence of what is forgotten. The ziggurats whisper of ambition without precedent. Before pyramids rose on the Nile, before stone temples crowned the hills of Greece, the people of Mesopotamia were already building upward. They dared to raise mountains from mud brick, to anchor heaven into the soil of the plain. Their ambition outlived their empires. Their names may fade, but the impulse they embodied, the reaching towards something higher, remains recognizable even now. In their decay, they also speak of fragility. Empires fell. Cities were abandoned. Bricks dissolved into dust. Yet the silhouette lingers. It is the paradox of the ziggurat. Permanence and impermanence intertwined. They were built to last forever, yet they crumble. They collapse into ruin, yet they refuse to vanish. They survive as ruins, as echoes in texts, as myths retold across continents. Their eternity lies not in stone, but in memory. The ziggurat is both monument and mirror. It reflects humanity's desire to root myth in matter, to make the invisible visible. It is at once a stairway for gods descending to earth, and for mortals seeking to ascend toward the divine. It is a calendar of stars, a throne of kings, a boundary between survival and aspiration. To ask which one is true is to misunderstand. Perhaps they were always all of these things at once. And so the mystery endures. To stand before their ruins is to feel the weight of questions unanswered. Were they observatories of the sky or mountains of the gods? Were they political declarations or spiritual thresholds? Or were they simply the human spirit made visible in clay? As the last light fades and the desert sky deepens with stars, the ruins seem almost to dissolve. Their lines blur, their presence wavers, until they are no longer just broken walls, but something older, something mythic. They become outlines on the horizon of memory, stairways not to heaven, but to wonder. In that silence, the eternal mystery of Mesopotamia remains, not a riddle to be solved, but a presence to be felt. The ziggurats remind us that human history is built not only on what we know, but also on what escapes us, on the longing that endures when answers dissolve into shadow. And so they stand, even now, broken, enduring, eternal, invitations in brick, asking us still to look upward and to question.